Chapter 247. In the deep blue space, countless stars were quietly watching the spaceships flying among them. The people on the spaceships were also watching them. In the field of vision below the dark star field, a giant hexagonal space station was reflecting the light of the stars. It was brighter than any of the stars in the field. The hexagonal space station quietly overlooked the surface of planet S1, ready to accept the spaceships that leaped out of the atmosphere at any time. Sulo stood beside the porthole, squinting his eyes as he watched the space station not far away. He was slightly excited. He had experienced space travel before. The last time he took the ancient bell from Donglin to the capital ring, it was at the giant space station that he took the spaceship to transfer to. However, the spaceship he took today did not stop at the space station. Instead, it directly broke through the gravitational pull and atmosphere of planet S1 and flew into space, heading towards the old moon base. The Shell Motor Company had its own commercial fleet. It was not large in number, but its performance was excellent. The technical team was going to the old moon base to participate in the test battle of the new MX mecha. Naturally, the headquarters provided the best spaceship, so there was no need to resupply or transfer at the space station. The light of the stars outside the window suddenly dimmed. Sula knew that the spaceship was changing direction. He walked back to his seat and looked at the serious expressions of his companions. He could not help but feel a little nervous. The technical staff of the Shell Motor Company were all wearing dark gray military uniforms. This was because, in a sense, they were all non-staff members of the Federal Army. Even Shang Qiu was a civilian major. In this spaceship, the only people who were not wearing military uniforms were Secretary Bai, who was beside Sulo, and the CEO who was sitting in the luxurious private room at the front of the spaceship. Bai Yulan had made a big mistake in the army years ago and was expelled from the army. The CEO did not want to use military uniforms to boost his confidence. The CEO of the Shell Motor Company, if placed in a place like East Forest or West Woods of the Federation, would be at the level of a district chief executive. A few days ago, the attitude of the Shell Motor Company during the internal struggle of the Federation was clearly not in line with the status of this giant company in the Federation. Sula thought of the CEO who was in his 40s and had some doubts in his heart. The CEO of the Shell Motor Company had not shown much in the past few days. The main reason was that the management committee of the Federation had appointed him as the CEO of the Shell Motor Company less than a year ago. Coincidentally, when he took over, many problems within the company. After the failure of the experiment last autumn, the Federal Academy of Science shamelessly and overbearingly joined in with the excuse of participating in the design of the dual-engine technology. This was an official decision made by the Federation's academic committee, so the Shell Motor Company could not use this to accuse the other party. However, right after that, the Academy of Science had stolen the data from Shin Yulin's laboratory. That independent director of the Shell Motor Company had also encountered some problems. All these troubles had gathered together, making this newly appointed CEO angry but also somewhat anxious. If the internal strife within the Shell Motor Company's board was like the internal strife within the Federation and had not been completely settled, the CEO could not spend all his time on these political squabbles. He knew better than anyone the importance of the MX mecha to the Federation and to the company. Thus, he personally led the technical team and boarded this spaceship headed for the old moon. The flight through space was truly rather tedious. Those provocatively dressed dancers on the screen did not attract too much attention. Everyone in the technical team was deep in thought about the mecha battle that would begin the day after tomorrow, analyzing the technical aspects that they were responsible for to ensure that there would not be any loopholes. Shang Qiu had not come with the technical team. The mecha battle testing, data analysis, and evaluation work at the old moon base would be carried out in the control hall on the ground. She still had very important work to do, so she had stayed behind. Su Le looked at Bai Yulan beside him, who had her head lowered the entire time. He could not help but think that if Shang Qiu had been by his side right now, the journey would probably not have been so boring. Secretary Bai was too quiet, she really was not a good travel companion. Right at this moment, a voice rang out from the communicator. Su Le was slightly taken aback. but then he got up from his chair and walked towards the room where the CEO was. Not long after, he walked back and sat back down with a heavy expression on his face. He could not help but glance at Bai Yulan again, wondering if he should tell her this news now or when the mecha battle begins. Bai Yulan saw the change in his mood and asked softly, "The other side has chosen?" "Yes." The mecha battle testing this time was of the utmost importance and had attracted the attention of countless people. Both sides would definitely choose the most experienced and most capable pilot in the Federation. Su Le guessed that the other side would not have guessed that Nutshell Company had long since made the decision to use Bai Yulan as their pilot. However, he also did not expect that the other side would actually have a way to persuade that fellow to come personally. After a moment of silence, he said, "It's madmanly." Bai Yulan's delicate eyebrows rose, then calmed down. Like a small stone thrown into a lake, it settled down after a slight ripple. After a moment of silence, he took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it up, and took a deep puff. Su Le had always thought that Secretary Bai did not smoke. He did not know that that night, when Bai Yulan had seen him operate the old mecha and make so many fierce attacks, she had secretly smoked a cigarette. He also did not know that when MX had succeeded, Bai Yulan had also smoked a cigarette. It was not that Secretary Bai did not smoke, but he would only light one when he felt a real tremor. The smoke detectors in the spaceship began to beep, and the electronic female voice began to warn them. The surrounding technical team members were all startled out of their thoughts and looked curiously at Su Le and Bai Yulan's seats. Then, they saw the two heavy and slightly tired faces, and in an instant, they understood something. Hearing the warning from the electronic female voice, Su Le's mood was somewhat irritated, and he wanted nothing more than to kick the loudspeaker away. "What I was afraid of has come." Bai Yulan only took 3 puffs before the cigarette between her fingers burned to a crisp. He coughed lightly and said, "Boss, looks like the people behind you are not as powerful as you think." At some point in time, Bai Yulan had begun to refer to Su Le as boss. Perhaps it was because of the 20 million Federation dollars. Su Le knew what she meant. In the special capital region, the two of them had had a long conversation. The Tai family, who had always stood behind Su Le, had always had a close relationship with the Lees of Philadelphia. Why did that lunatic from the Lee family want to interfere in this mecha battle this time? Mr. CEO had also just received the news. Su Le was currently in the spaceship. Even though he had hundreds of questions in his heart, he could not make a phone call to clear them all up, so he could only remain silent. Secretary Bai lowered his eyes slightly, and his fingers slowly pinched the remaining half of the cigarette. Thinking of the insufferably arrogant opponent in 2 days, he also fell silent. Just as the two of them were silent, a barren planet appeared in front of the spaceship. The earthy yellow surface of the planet was even clearer under the light of the stars. Only the pearl-like structures on the surface and the black materials scattered all around reminded people that this was not an uninhabited barren planet, but the largest companion of Planet S1, Old Moon. Humanity's second entry into the universe, and the first planet to be officially developed was one of the 2 moons, Old Moon. In the literature, this satellite that had accompanied Planet S1 for billions of years was called Moon Number 1, but the people of the Federation usually called it Old Moon. The development of the Old Moon had been going on for many years. Although scientists had tried to recreate the ecosystem, they had failed time and time again. The phenomenon of atmospheric escape in a low-gravity environment could not be eliminated. However, the development of the Old Moon by humans was extremely deep. Those pearl-like structures that could be seen from space were actually as many as 700 residential bases. The bases were covered with high-strength multi-layer rigid membranes that filtered the blazing light of the stars and the omnipresent cosmic rays. At the same time, the life support system of the bases was isolated from the outside world. The black material that was about to cover a quarter of Old Moon's land area was transformed from the mineral resources of the 4 neighboring planets into a solar energy collection and absorption material. Now, it was completely capable of supplying energy to countless military and civilian bases on Old Moon. The ubiquitous black was one of the 5 largest planetary transformation activities in the history of the Federation. It cost a lot of money and time, and it was one of the greatest glories of humanity. Under the pen of a poet, they would often describe how the giant pen of humanity painted a barren planet in the sky with a layer of unnatural color. It was naturally earth-shattering to be able to change the world. Of the 700 bases on Old Moon, the largest was naturally the Federal Military's main assembly base and the Shell Motor Company's spaceship manufacturing factory. It was said that in the military control zone on the dark side of the moon, there was a super-large base that was specifically responsible for supplying the three major fleets of the Federation. However, the ordinary people of the Federation would never be able to see its true appearance. Under the guidance of the Flight Control Center on Old Moon's surface, a pale white commercial spaceship drew a nearly straight arc as it headed towards the predetermined landing site. Just by looking at the exterior design of this spaceship, it was obvious that this was a direct endurance spaceship that could break through the S1 atmosphere. On the side of the spaceship was a line of very eye-catching words, "Where there is metal, there is fruit shell." Seeing the pearl-like large bases becoming clearer and clearer, the technical team members on the spaceship had already stood up and let out waves of exclamations. Humanity's transformation of the universe always made these engineers feel a sense of respect from the bottom of their hearts. These engineers and professors were researching mecha, not space battleships. For most of them, this was their first time at Old Moon bases, and that kind of excitement was indescribable. At this time, they were not even willing to think about the mecha battle that would take place the day after tomorrow. The boundless black sea that stretched out like the grasslands of the Eastwood region was indeed an extremely magnificent sight. And those pearl-like bases that were covered by a giant membrane were also an exciting process. Sulu should have been excited by everything in front of him, but the extremely bad news during the journey made his heart feel a little heavy, and he actually somewhat ignored this magnificent scenery. The Shell Motor Company's exclusive spaceship did not land at its own base, but instead flew directly to the Ministry of Defense's Space Assembly Base. Accompanied by the loud sound of airflow and the electronic positioning siren, the spaceship steadily landed on the dock, and then a large piece of shrinking equipment placed it underground. The alarm was lifted, and the technical team disembarked from the spaceship. They sat on the self-propelled electric scooter below the spaceship and followed the 10-kilometer-long underground tunnel towards the dark and quiet front. Mr. CEO had a special car to pick him up and had already left. The moment they left, Sulu noticed that Mr. CEO's expression was a little gloomy. Beside him, his secretary was holding a phone and arguing non-stop with certain parties. The CEO of Nutshell probably also smelled a trace of danger. There were too many people in the Federation who did not want Nutshell to get the standard for the new mecha. Thinking of this, Sulu could not help but feel a little cold. Even if the Iron Schemer was one of the 7 great families in the Federation, how could they have such a huge influence? He looked at his phone and confirmed that there was signal in the underground tunnel, so he directly called Secretary Shen. Over the phone, he told the other party the news he had just received, and then quietly waited for the other party to reply. Shunli was silent for a long time on the other end of the phone before saying, "I just verified this news. According to the intelligence report, it should be that Senator Macklin who gave the idea to the National Security Advisor. As for the Philadelphia side, I don't have that kind of influence." "What about the madam?" Sulu continued to ask. If it was in the past, no matter who the other party chose to be the pilot, it would not affect his confidence in Little White Flower and his judgment of the Purple Sea. However, Li Feng was different. He was a madman, the only grandson of the Lees of Philadelphia, and a rare super pilot in the federal military. At this time, if Su Lu and Madman Li were to fight, he would not mind. However, as Bai Yulon had said before, when it came to mecha piloting, Madman Li's ability was too terrifying. This was a result of his battle record. Sitting under the huge dome, Sulu looked at the layer of transparent film 10 meters away from him through the glass. He was curious about the material of the film and the operating principle of the gravity replenishment device in the base. Only when he was in space could he truly feel the extent to which the technological civilization of the Federation had developed over the past tens of thousands of years. Even though he was known as a genius in mechanical engineering, it was impossible for him to completely understand the intricate technological fields. After a few calls, there was no good news. Mr. CEO's secretary had called earlier and helplessly said that the company's negotiations with the Federation government had all failed. This was because in the meeting in the president's office, the military god of the Lees of Philadelphia had personally promised the national security advisor that both parties could choose whichever pilot they wanted. It was because of this heavy mood that Sulu decided to just focus on the structure of the final assembly base. However, no matter how he looked at the scene in space outside the film, he still could not calm down. There was even a faint trace of regret in his heart. If he had known this would happen, should he have asked Madman Lee to be the pilot for Nutshell first? The living area of the final assembly base was very quiet. On the dome about a few hundred meters high, the automatic superlight cleaning maintenance robot was slowly working along the alloy framework. Sulu picked up the teacup in front of him and took a sip. He then felt that his thoughts were really a little unfair to Bai Yulan in front of him. "What you said in the hotel that day was a lie," Bai Yulan said softly. Bai Yulan said softly, "I've seen Li Feng operate a mecha with my own eyes. I don't have the slightest bit of confidence against him. However, since our goal is only to drag that purple sea into an unrestricted battle for 3 minutes, it is possible." Hearing this, Su Li's mood gradually calmed down. If they wanted to go head-to-head with the only remaining seedling of the Lees of Philadelphia, there was no point in looking for other ace pilots in the federal military. In comparison, Secretary Bai's understanding of the new MX mecha was deeper than anyone else's. Moreover, Sulu had always believed that this delicate man's strength had never been fully utilized. "It won't change anything," Sulu picked up the teacup and said seriously, "Let's deal with him." Bai Yulan picked up the teacup and clinked it lightly with him. After hurriedly finishing the cup of tea, the technical team did not stay for long. They immediately rushed towards the core area of the base. Yesterday, Nutshell's MX mecha had already been transported from the port to the Old Moon base under the close watch of the military. According to the schedule, they were about to begin the mecha combat test, modifying the outer armor and weakening the firepower of the mecha. The technical team members of Nutshell's engineering department naturally had to watch with their own eyes. Otherwise, who knew what those mechanics from the Ministry of National Defense would do to their precious mecha? The members of the technical team went through the chip scan one by one and obtained temporary access to the Old Moon base. They walked towards the underground warehouse. They saw the mecha in the center of the warehouse in the distance and began to get excited. Although it had only been 7 days since they last saw each other, to these people, it felt like a long time. Sulu and Bai Yulan were still walking at the back. There was no problem with the chip scan. However, just as the two of them were about to enter the warehouse, a group of armed soldiers surrounded them. "Sulu, the technical director of the Nutshell Engineering Department?" An official in a black suit asked coldly. Sulu narrowed his eyes and said, "Yes. You can go in now." "This person stays," the official said as he pointed at Bai Yulan. Sulu narrowed his eyes even more. He asked, "Why?" Bai Yulan was suspected of illegally selling military equipment to foreign countries. "Therefore, he cannot enter the core area," the official replied. Sulu knew about Secretary Bai's crimes. However, the military court did not convict him. Why did some people suddenly appear at such an important time? Unexpectedly, the faction from the Federal Academy of Science started to make their move again. Not only did they use Madman Lee as a test pilot, they also tried to stop Bai Yulan at the last minute. He looked at the official's cold face and suddenly said, "This is a test pilot from Nutshell's company. He cannot enter the core area. Then how will the mecha battle start? Can you bear this kind of responsibility? Not only can he not enter the core area, he will have to follow me immediately for further investigation." The official smiled and said, "You don't have to scare me with the MX mecha battle. I am not a Federation official. Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" Sulu could no longer suppress the anger in his heart. He stared into the official's eyes and said loudly, "I don't care what kind of fucking official you are. If you dare to stop us, let's see how you will answer to the president." Chapter 248. Sulu had met many big shots in the Federation. Not to mention the president, who had been very kind to him throughout the journey and had solemnly instructed him to do so. Even the mother and son of the Tai family, as well as General Zhou Yingxing, were all big shots that could shake the surface of a planet with just a word from the Federation. However, meeting big shots did not mean that he could completely understand the way they did things. To be more precise, he still had not gotten rid of the moral standards of the citizens at the bottom of the hierarchy. He always thought that no matter if it was a politician or a politician, they would still need to maintain their dignity and do things according to the rules of the Federation. Even if they were faced with a strong conflict of interest, the way these people snatched benefits was always elegant, calm, and confident. It was just like how the Federal Academy of Science took the data of Professor Shen from the Husk Institute. Everything was done so cleanly, and they looked down from above, swallowed mountains and rivers, and silently flowed like a clear spring, until today, when he first heard that Madman Li was selected to be the pilot, and then this guy who called himself an official of the Bureau of Proclamation led soldiers to stop by Yulan and was about to arrest her. Su Le finally understood that when the big shots in the upper echelons of the Federation had their fundamental interests infringed, they would not hesitate to show their greedy and cold appearance. As long as they had the slightest reason, they would use extreme methods and do things to the extreme. They would endlessly show the realm of shamelessness that they could reach. What does this have to do with the Bureau of Proclamation? If you want to go to military court, it's the Department of Defense's business. Because of this understanding, Su Le could no longer suppress the anger that he had been suppressing for a long time. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the official in front of him. His gaze was like a knife that could cut the indifferent face of the other party into countless mottled pieces at any moment. Correspondingly, he could no longer play the role of a silent, optimistic, and cheerful technician. Instead, he began to emit a lonely and ruthless aura from his bones. What does this have to do with the Bureau of Proclamation? The Bureau of Proclamation doesn't need to tell you. The official ignored his anger and replied with a smile. The Bureau of Proclamation was usually only responsible for coordinating with the work of the government. They rarely showed themselves directly. Today's trip to the Old Moon base was due to the persuasion of some powerful people within the Federation government. In fact, the Shell Motor Company had already entered the Old Moon base. At this time, only a transcendental existence like the Bureau of Proclamation would dare to challenge the rules of the entire Federation. They would not hesitate to destroy an important new mecha test battle just to arrest this pilot named Bai Yulan. This official was not worried about the Shell Motor Company's counterattack. The Bureau of Proclamation rarely took action, but once it did, no government would dare to go against it, let alone an enterprise. Under the glory of the First Charter, these officials seemed to be covered with a layer of inviolable brilliance. Su Le stood in front of Bai Yulan and unceremoniously slapped the gun barrel away. His strength was so great that even a casual slap caused the soldier's wrist to ache. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became tense. What are you looking at? Su Le narrowed his eyes and scanned the stiff attitude of the soldiers around him. He said in a low voice, "Shoot me if you dare." At this time, he naturally thought of that rainy night in the industrial park of Harbor City. However, at that time, he and Bai Yulan were facing the mercenaries of the Whitewater Company. Today, however, he was facing an official from the Bureau of Proclamation and the soldiers of the Federation. Over and over again, the schemes of the upper class of the Federation and the cold and unreasonable sledgehammers kept falling on his head. He was really tired of it. However, last time, he had the military order of the Ministry of Defense to protect him. This time, he was facing the Bureau of Proclamation. Who would come down from the sky to save him and Bai Yulan? The day after tomorrow, the government of the Federation would secretly conduct a mecha battle test. At this time, Su Le believed that the other party would not dare to use violence. He also could not allow these soldiers to arrest Secretary Bai. If the ace pilots he had secretly prepared for several months were all arrested, who would go up against that madman Li the day after tomorrow? Bai Yulan kept his head down and stood behind him. He did not stand in front of him to block the muzzle of the gun like he usually did. Perhaps it was because the other party's sudden attack today was related to him. He was even more silent than usual. However, when he saw Su Le angrily pull out the gun barrel, the corners of his eyes trembled slightly. He vaguely remembered the feeling of being protected by his comrades in the military camp all those years ago. The technical team members who had finished scanning the area noticed the strange movement at the door. They all walked back. After knowing the truth of the matter, their expressions changed drastically. They threw away the elegant demeanor of a scholar and scolded the Bureau of Proclamation official and the soldiers. They also threatened to inform the Ministry of Defense immediately. However, it was obvious that the Ministry of Defense could not threaten the Bureau of Proclamation official. In fact, this official had only taken a document from the Bureau of Proclamation and was able to command the soldiers stationed at the Old Moon base to do as he wished. This kind of authority was terrifying. Su Lu was calling the CEO. Since the other party had used such a shameless move, other than the CEO himself, the technical team members could not think of any other way. However, the call did not go through. Whether it was the CEO or the secretary's phone, both were turned off. He narrowed his eyes. He knew that the other party must have been prepared. Perhaps, the departure of the CEO was arranged by the other party. Bai Yulan's hands were hidden in her sleeves. Suddenly, she sighed and slowly took her hands out. From this sigh, Su Lu could hear many emotions. There was unwillingness to accept defeat, as well as helplessness and disappointment. Bai Yulan had joined the army when he was 15 years old. He didn't have any background or support. When he entered the Special Mecha Battalion of the 17th Armored Division, his small knife and his amazing mecha piloting skills were his true foundation. It was also because of his achievements on the front lines that he was only expelled from the army after he violated the military order. He wasn't sent to the military court. Even though she was a fierce veteran, after knowing that the opponent's pilot was Mad Manly from Philadelphia, she still wanted to avoid the battle. During this journey in space, Bai Yulan had done a lot of psychological preparation. She had stimulated the most powerful part of her mental world. That was why she could calmly say those words to Su Lu at the tea table. Bai Yulan had already decided to give it her all and leave no regrets. She wanted to see just how strong the grandson of her teacher was. However, just as she was about to summon her tiger chi, she was blocked by a pack of jackals and wolves in the forest. Heroes should have a place to use their abilities. Those people wanted to shamelessly take away this opportunity from Bai Yulan when he was at his peak. That sigh had a sense of unwillingness and indifference. From the corner of Su Li's eyes, she noticed that Bai Yulan was not holding the delicate knife when she took it out of her pocket. Bai Yulan lowered her eyes and said, "I'll go with you." She had to go. The situation now was different from that rainy night. The faction led by the Federal Academy of Science was not even afraid to use their connections within the Bureau of Proclamation to prove that they were determined to win the Federation Mecha Standard battle at all costs. Although the destruction of Jade and Stone was tragic, the problem was that the opponent had only piled up a pile of firewood. Su Lu, on the other hand, was a 1,000-year-old gem in this mecha battle. Bai Yulan could not just stand by and watch Su Lu fall into the opponent's trap because of his anger. "If you leave, what will we do?" scolded Su Lu angrily. "They just don't want me to participate in this mecha battle," said Bai Yulan softly. "At most, they'll just lock me up for a few days and I'll be fine. As for the mecha battle the day after tomorrow, you can go on your own." These last few words, Secretary Bai had said them very softly. Only Su Lu, who was standing in front of her, could hear them. A strange light flashed through Su Li's eyes. He had not expected Secretary Bai to make such a suggestion. That said, Bai Yulan stretched out her hands. He knew that he was still paying back his debts for all the mistakes he had made in the military back then, as well as last autumn in Bermuda. Since the Bureau of Proclamation had appeared, they had naturally evaded the blockade of Unit 8384 and obtained evidence of his crimes directly. Who knew how many years he would be sentenced to by the Federation Court? "No need," said the Bureau of Proclamation official with a smile. He too knew the significance of the mecha battle 2 days later. He was actually not very confident, so he only asked Bai Yulan to cooperate with the investigation. He had no intention of directly arresting her. After all, he had to take care of Nutshell's emotions. Bai Yulan looked at his smile, but did not feel the need to be taken care of. She smiled gently, and then silently kicked out with her leg, striking the official's lower abdomen. With a muffled thud, the Bureau of Proclamation official fell to the ground. His face was pale. He wanted to scream in pain, but the pain pierced deep into his lower abdomen, rendering him unable to speak. This kick had startled many people present. The soldiers immediately raised their guns. At this time, Bai Yulan lowered her head and said softly, "I've already stated that I won't resist arrest. I hit him because of a personal grudge. If you want to sue me in court for fighting, I don't mind." Su Lu did not feel the slightest bit of relief from this kick. He looked silently at Bai Yulan, ignoring the official who was rolling on the ground in pain. He said, "I will get you out as soon as possible." Bai Yulan smiled slightly and said softly, "If you're angry, you need to vent. If you do things with this attitude the day after tomorrow, perhaps the results will surprise many people, including yourself." "I'm very angry." Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the white MX mecha undergoing modification in the middle of the warehouse. He thought of the little white flower that Shang Qiu had named it, and thought of Bai Yulan who had already been taken away. He said into the phone, "I've never expected the Federation to be fair, but I also didn't expect that in the face of such a situation, those people would actually dare to play politics so brazenly." After the CEO of Nutshell Mobile had returned and found out that the pilot he had chosen had been taken away by the Bureau of Proclamation, he was naturally enraged to the extreme. He had even called the president directly, but since the matter involved the Bureau of Proclamation, even the president's office had no way of ordering the other party to release the pilot immediately. He had not expected that the other party would be so shameless and direct, not caring at all about the issue of face. In his anger, he had made several calls to the Ministry of National Defense and scolded the federal military, but he still could not change the fact that had already happened. Even Nutshell Mobile's request to use this matter to delay the mecha battle was flatly rejected by the National Security Advisor in charge of this mecha test this time. At this time, Su Lu was on the phone with Zhou Yu. On one hand, he wanted to find out what was happening on the surface of Planet S1, and on the other hand, he wanted to vent the anger in his heart. On the surface of a conflict of interest, there is often a veneer of political harmony. However, if the benefits are big enough, people are not afraid to tear off this veneer and rush forward to snatch food, just like the wild beasts in the forest on the other side of the electronic fence. On the phone, Zhou Yu said softly, "The battle of the MX mecha involves a lot of benefits, and it also concerns Dean Lin's reputation in this life. He doesn't want to step down without any dignity, so naturally he won't care about these things. In the end, for you to be able to help Nutshell Mobile force the other into such a blatant ugliness is already very impressive." She glanced at the child in the nanny's arms and lowered her voice to say, "The winner is the king, and the loser is the thief. As long as the result is achieved, not many people care about the process. Right now, for you, the key is to help that little white flower win in the mecha battle the day after tomorrow. The Ministry of National Defense has urgently sent an ace pilot over," Su Lu said after a moment's silence, "but the opponent is using madmanly, that's why I don't understand what the other side is thinking. Although the Lees of Philadelphia have always been known for their neutrality, I believe that if the madam is really willing to help Nutshell Mobile, she will definitely be able to do more. I remember Tai Ziyuan once said that the old director of the Bureau of Proclamation was a seventh-generation relative of his. I'm not sure about that either." Hearing Madman Lee's name, Zhou Yu's tone became a little more cautious. "Right now, you can only hope that the ace pilot father has chosen for you all is stronger than that secretary of yours." After hanging up the phone, Su Lu walked closer to take a look at the mecha that was being modified. The engineers of Nutshell Mobile carried on with their own work with gloomy expressions. They stared at the mechanics of the main assembly base as they changed the firepower system and installed the outer armor sensor equipment without blinking. They had already arrived at the old moon base, but in the end, the opponent had still used underhanded means to take away their test pilot. The engineers of Nutshell Mobile all knew what this meant. Of course, they were worried that these mechanics of the main assembly base would not be too clean. Sulu walked out of the core area warehouse and asked for a cup of green tea in the living area. He leaned against the glass wall and sipped on it. Through the many layers of rigid film, he looked at the desolate but moving surface of the moon outside the base and lit a cigarette. He smoked one cigarette after another until he felt that his lips were a little numb. The smoke made him squint his eyes. Only then did he feel a little better. He remembered what Bai Yulan had said before she was taken away and lightly clenched his fists. A soft synthesized female voice sounded, indicating that there was an external ship landing outside the main assembly base. Sulu did not pay attention to it. President Sieg and the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would be watching the mecha battle from afar in the control hall of S1 the day after tomorrow. These 2 days, the spaceships that were taking off and landing at the old moon base were mostly engineers and logisticians. A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps could be heard from the entrance of the underground tunnel leading from the spaceship berth to the base. These footsteps were very steady, as if a group of soldiers were marching forward. Sulu subconsciously turned his head to look, but his line of sight was blocked by the buildings. He could only see that many officers and mechanics in the living area were all walking towards the sound of the footsteps. Their faces were filled with excitement as they stood on both sides of the road. The first to enter his field of vision were the 10 or so professors from the Federal Academy of Science. It was obvious that the sound of these professors' footsteps had been drowned out by the sound of footsteps behind them. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He held his teacup and looked around the corner. Applause rang out first. The soldiers of the old moon base automatically stood in 2 rows to welcome the new arrival. Under the protection of several officers, the youngest lieutenant colonel in the history of the Federation walked out of the corner into the eyes of the applause and burning gazes, and into Su Li's sight. For the Federal Army, the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia was already worthy of such treatment. Moreover, Madman Lee had already proven himself to be a legendary figure in the Federation with his insane battle results on the front lines in the West Woods. Su Li narrowed his eyes and looked over there. He realized that Li Feng was not as arrogant and haughty as he had seen before. The 16-year-old lieutenant colonel was gracefully bowing and thanking the applauding soldiers around him. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Madman Lee was just about to say something when he suddenly felt a gaze on him from behind. It made him feel extremely uncomfortable, so he instinctively turned his head and saw Su Li standing by the wall with a cup of green tea in his hand. Madman Lee narrowed his eyes. A hint of delight flashed across his features, like a tiger in the woods who had seen its most delicious prey. Although he had only participated in the mecha combat test to carry out the orders of the Department of National Defense, being able to defeat the mecha of the Shell Motor Company and make that fellow lose face was truly his greatest motivation. Hundreds of officers and technicians in the living quarters of the old moon base all noticed the gaze of the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia. They were all very curious as to who was worthy of his serious gaze. From the whispers of a few people, the crowd found out that the skinny young man standing by the wall was the technical supervisor of the Shell Motor Company. He was specifically in charge of the maintenance of the new mecha combat test this time. Under countless curious gazes, Li Feng waved his hand to stop the officers behind him from following him. He slowly walked towards Su Li, each step steady and full of awe. Su Li's figure wasn't thin, but compared to Li Feng's body that was filled with strength, he looked a little delicate. He lowered his eyes and looked at the teacup in his hand, as if he had not noticed the arrival of this person. I said before that I would kill you with my own hands, but it's a pity that you don't know how to operate a mecha. Besides, this is a military mission. Even if you are in a mecha, I can't really kill you. Li Feng said seriously, but since I'm here, your Shell Motor Company doesn't have much hope anymore. No matter how bad that Purple Sea from the Academy of Science is, the outcome will be the same. If such domineering words came out of someone else's mouth, they would only find it ridiculous. However, this person had gone to the front lines to kill enemies at the age of 12, piloting an M52 and slaughtering the Empire's Royal Mecha Battalion. Yet, coming out of his mouth, it sounded so natural. The original pilot was called Bai Yulan. A few hours ago, he was here. He promised me that he would take care of you. Sulu lowered his head and said, "Unfortunately, those bastards you're fighting for have robbed him of the chance to take care of you. Invincible in the military?" He stared at the teacup and muttered to himself, "Look at how confident you are. I suddenly want to make a bet with you." Madmanly looked at him with a strange gaze and said, "Go ahead. If Shell Motor loses, from now on, I will kneel when I see you and call you invincible. If you lose, give up the entire universe when you see me and stop bothering me. At the same time, remember to call me uncle. Or you can take down the door sign of the Feiching Manor and give it to me." As he slowly said these words, Sulu was still staring at the green tea in his cup, as if he was staring at the ugly faces of many important people in the Federation. Chapter 249. Just like any scene in a play, when two people who had no standpoint and were natural enemies met each other, sparks flew in all directions amidst their calm words. The surrounding extras naturally had to express their rich inner emotions with silence and astonishment at the appropriate time. They were inexplicably surprised by the bet. The population of the Federation was in the billions, and the Federal Army was in the millions. The number of heroes in history was innumerable. No one would have thought that a thin technician would say that he would dismantle the house number of the Lees of Philadelphia in front of the descendant of the god of war. Although Sulu and Madmanly did not speak loudly, they did not deliberately avoid the surrounding crowd. The contents of the bet were clearly stated. When it fell into the ears of the crowd, how arrogant and even exaggerated was this? The arrogance of the Lees of Philadelphia had its own historical reasons and the fanatical support of the people of the Federation as its foundation. But what qualifications did this technician have to be arrogant? Sulu was an arrogant person. His mood was calm and cheerful, like an ancient mirror made of water talc. In front of a gentle person, he would be gentle, and in front of a kind person, he would be kind. Whatever the world gave him, he would give back. When he was young, he always thought that the world was beautiful, so what he showed was a happy smile with his white teeth exposed. Now that he realized that the world was not like that, his expression naturally became a little heavier. When he was in the hospital, he did not want to give in to the wild and violent Madmanly, not to mention that he was in an extremely bad mood today, so he directly confronted him. This confrontation actually caused Madmanly to be silent for a long time. The 16-year-old lieutenant colonel of the Federation slowly narrowed his eyes. A hint of cruelty flashed across his youthful face, but he immediately returned to calmness. After confirming that every word Sulu said was true, he said, "There are countless tons of crystal ores under a man's knees. I don't want you to kneel to me. If that little white flower nutshell is crushed this time, I only ask that you never see Zoyu again for the rest of your life. Don't show up in the capital ring again. Get the hell out of here as far as the Federation's warships can. It's settled then." Sulu placed the teacup on the table and prepared to leave. He didn't want the officers of the Old Moon base to look at him like he was an idiot. With his hands behind his back, Madmanly narrowed his eyes as he watched Li Du walk towards the corridor. He suddenly said, "Perhaps you have your own reasons for being angry. Those old guys at the Academy of Science are really bastards." Sulu stopped, but he didn't turn around. "But this has nothing to do with me. I am a soldier of the Federation. I am here to participate in the mecha duel this time because I am following orders from the Ministry of Defense. I will not be angered by this bet. Since you've stayed in a body cultivation hall before, you should be very clear that the Purple Sea's maneuverability can only be displayed in the hands of someone like me. It's best if you tell Nutshell's pilots about these things as soon as possible." Sulu lowered his head slightly. He knew what Madmanly meant. The two of them had exchanged blows in the Linyuan before. Although it had only been for a split second, they could both feel each other's strength in close-range combat. Madmanly seemed to have misunderstood him as an unknown expert nurtured by that body cultivation hall. Naturally, he thought that only the two of them knew how terrifying a new-generation twin-engine mecha was when a close-range combat expert was piloting it. Hearing Madmanly's words, Sulu suddenly remembered what General Zhou Yingxing had told him before. The army was not allowed to think. The Lees of Philadelphia specialized in nurturing the most standard professional soldiers of the Federation. The 16-year-old madman Lee already had the faint feeling of military god Lee Pifu from back in the day. However, he seemed to be more unbridled. This was probably the side effect of youth. However, from these few words, it was obvious that Li Feng was not a lunatic who only knew how to kill. That night, the entire Old Moon base was discussing the arrival of the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia. The legend of military god Li Pifu had gradually faded away. As for the story of the invincible madman Li, the soldiers stationed at the capital ring had only heard of it from their comrades who had retired from the front lines. Piloting an M-52 and facing off against a team of soldiers from the Imperial Royal Mecha Battalion, what kind of level was this? The thought of being able to see the operation of those mechas with their own eyes in a few dozen hours made everyone excited. In the central area of the base, the warehouse allocated to the Shell Motor Company was shrouded in a low pressure. The mixed air provided by the life support system made the technicians feel a little strange. In fact, they knew very well that this strange feeling came entirely from the gradual loss of confidence. The pilot of the Purple Sea Mecha was Madman Lee. The higher the reputation of this young lieutenant colonel in the military, the more helpless the technicians of the Shell Company felt. This was especially so after the Magnolia, who was chosen first, was taken away by the Bureau of Proclamation. The CEO of the Shell Company was still angrily negotiating with the government, but time was running out. That night, at 11 o'clock, another spaceship arrived at the Old Moon base from planet S1. The reserve pilot, accompanied by a team of soldiers and board members of the company, walked into the warehouse. If even this reserve pilot was taken away by the other party's tricks, the Shell Motor Company would most likely report the whole incident to the media and have a war with the government. In the dead of the night, all the technicians returned to their own rooms anxiously. The modification of the mecha program in the base had been completed. No problems were found, but they still felt a little uneasy. Su Le sat on the box under the pure white MX mecha. He chewed on the bread in his hand and mumbled, "I really didn't expect the reserve pilot to be you." Zhou Yu slowly chewed on the bread and smiled. "Who else can you find at the last minute? Other than that secretary of yours, I'm the most familiar with MX." This ace student of the first military college's mecha department was already drenched in sweat. Previously, he had cooperated with the technical team to perform the hot start and basic operations, which had used up some of his energy. He looked at the lonely Su Lu and his heart skipped a beat. He tried to be as gentle as possible. "I know Secretary Bai is the pilot you've been secretly preparing for several months, but since the other party has used such a dirty trick, there's no other way. Now, you can only trust me and support me." Su Lu did not believe Zhou Yu's ability, which was praised by the entire First Military College. However, he always thought that a pilot had to have gone through real battles before to know the taste of death and blood. Only then could the MX's super maneuverability be displayed in a swift and fierce manner. Looking at the sweaty Zhou Yu, Su Lu suddenly felt that life was really strange. The first time he had piloted a mecha in battle was this officer beside him. And now, he had to snatch the control rights of Little White Flower from the other's hands. Zhou Yu did not notice Su Li's intentions. He only comforted him. Major Lan Xiaolong, who was in charge of protecting you, also knew that White Magnolia was arrested. He notified the military officer of 8384, so you don't have to worry. Speaking of which, they're all from the 17th Armored Division. If the war god's own people were treated unfairly like this, he would definitely speak up. The military has always been very protective of its own people, but it's too late. He continued, this time, the mecha battle standard was actually decided by the war god. Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng was conscripted by the Academy of Science. This is a kind of balance. Otherwise, anyone could see that Fei Cheng was on Nutshell's side. Do you know about cultivation centers? Su Lu suddenly asked. There aren't many left in the capital ring. There are still some in Bermuda, Zhou Yu replied. After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, how confident are you against Madman Li? How would you know if you don't fight? Zhou Yu closed his eyes. When the time comes, I'll go. Su Le didn't explain anything else and said very naturally. Zhou Yu stared at him in shock. For a long time, he was speechless. Outside the capital special district, the heavily guarded all-weather command hall of the Ministry of National Defense was already packed with people even though it was still early in the morning. The three large holographic screens in front of the hall were performing signal synchronization. Below them, countless workstations were busily performing calculations. The citizens of the Federation didn't know that in this building, a very important matter was about to be decided today. The staff in the hall had a solemn expression on their faces. The Federal Academy of Science and the Shell Motor Company each took up a large work area in the two corners of the hall. The middle area was reserved for the technical officers of the Ministry of National Defense. Behind these staff, on several rows of comfortable seats, there were already more than 20 important people in military uniforms or civilian clothes. These people could basically decide many things in the Federation, but today, they could only watch the result and then passively announce the conclusion based on this result. The director of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, sat in the middle of these important people. His aged face was calm. The generals and officials beside him couldn't tell if he was feeling anxious or not. As a leading figure in the academic world of the Federation, he had too many connections, supporters, and admirers in the political world. This was why so many people stood firmly behind the Academy of Science, cheering for him and helping him handle many things that he didn't want to handle personally. Looking at the battle environment of the Old Moon polar region that was gradually becoming clearer on the holographic screen, Lin Yuanhu narrowed his eyes slightly. He thought that once this was over, it was time for him to retire. Using a new generation of mecha as a closing song was a good choice. The feedback last night said that the ace pilot that had been secretly trained by the Shell Company for 100 days had been brought back by the Bureau of Proclamation. Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had also started experimenting with the mecha. It seemed that there was nothing else to worry about. Below, in the Shell Motor Company's work area, Shang Qiu took off her glasses and rubbed her forehead. Looking at the technical data on the screen, she felt a headache coming on. She subconsciously turned to look at Lin Yuanhu, who was in the stands. She habitually scratched her itchy hair with the tip of her pen. She wondered if Zhou Yu would be able to force the Purple Sea into overclocking mode for 3 minutes in a mecha battle. A large military nearland spaceship landed in the Old Moon polar region of the Khaki Mountains. This region above latitude was under the direct rays of the stars all year round. The temperature was extremely high, and the terrain was extremely complex. Choosing this mountain range as the training ground for the Federation's new mecha would allow them to truly judge the combat capabilities and overall maintenance standards of the mecha from both sides. The back of the Old Moon was the base of the Federal Fleet. There was also a subsidiary base near the Khaki Mountains. 2 new mecha that carried the future of the Federal Army's new mecha were currently in the base making the final preparations for battle testing. All the technical staff had already left. The CEO of the Shell Company patted Zhou Yu's shoulder with a serious expression and said, "During your graduation exam, you defeated an instructor from the 1st Academy's mecha department within 1 minute. That was an ace pilot who had won the Purple Merit Medal, so you must have confidence in yourself." A complicated expression flashed across Zhou Yu's eyes. He said softly, "Please don't worry." After the CEO left, only Zhou Yu and Su Le were left in this area of the base. As the technical supervisor of the mecha, Su Le still had to finalize some final parameters and set up the monitoring authority. In the eerily quiet environment, Zhou Yu glanced at the white MX mecha that was 7 meters tall in front of him and suddenly asked, "Do you have confidence?" This was the question Su Le had asked him the night before. Zhou Yu really wanted to know how he would answer. Su Le closed the control panel on the ground and said calmly, "Against Madmanly, I don't have the slightest bit of confidence." After a moment of silence, he added, "But I have the determination." Zhou Yu looked at the back of the figure that was dragging the heavy black box and climbing up the mecha. Suddenly, he said loudly, "You really are a lunatic. I can't believe I actually agreed to let you go. I'm also a lunatic. Don't forget, the person we're going to face today is a lunatic." Su Le did not turn his head as he replied loudly. Zhou Yu had come from the West Woods to the capital to study. Along the way, he had been branded with the mark of excellence. Thus, he had become increasingly steady and gentle, never making a single mistake. Until the night before, when he had heard Su Li's request, he had discovered that he could occasionally go a little crazy. Watching Su Li crawl into the cockpit, he suddenly felt that this kind of craziness might be exchanged for a very good result. After all, this fellow's talent in the field of mecha was indeed very frightening. Closing the cockpit door and opening the black box, he took out the simulation system and installed it. Then, he connected the cable to the MX Mecha's standard interface. This was originally a data channel that Shang Qiu had reserved for him at his suggestion during the final design phase. The warm-up of the mecha had long been completed. Su Li quietly looked at the feedback of the mecha's data from his helmet. Feeling the slight numbness on his skin, he gently pressed down on the red button. According to the privacy regulations of the First Charter, a pilot's personal operation data could be kept confidential. For the ace pilots of the military, those skills that were exclusive to them were things that they had exchanged for with their lives. Unless the military conscripted them, no one could even dream of spying on their operations. Even the command hull watching from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away was no exception. Thus, Su Li was not worried that his use of the simulation system would be discovered by others. In fact, this was also one of the things he relied on to participate in the mecha battle and face Madman Li head-on. Perhaps someone would detect something from the way he operated the mecha and bring him some unknown danger, but he already did not care. Almost at the same time, in the underground base of the Kaki Mountains, in the Old Moon Assembly Base, in the S1 Capital Command Hall, the sound of an electronic countdown rang out. 10, 9, 8, 7. Su Li calmly listened to the electronic countdown. His left hand was on the control stick, and his right hand was on the touch screen. This idea of mixing two control methods was probably only an unconventional engineer like him would dare to try. As the last chime rang out, the lights below the base dimmed for a moment. The sound of air leakage whistled, but it could not reach the inside of the mecha. The alloy hatch at the top of the base took 2 seconds to open. The load-bearing lift platform below slowly transported the heavy white MX mecha to the surface of the moon. The vision of reality merged with the light green capture system and appeared in the window of the helmet. Su Li narrowed his eyes. As far as the eye could see, he could only see light all around him. The windless and dust-free Kaki Mountains were bathed in the blazing light. It was a scene of tranquility and danger. The central control computer of the MX Mecha had already issued a warning. A vacuum environment was a very severe test for the life support system. Fortunately, the MX Mecha had considered this point when it was designed for combat. Even if the exterior of the mecha was damaged, the internal cockpit could still ensure an independent life support system. It was just that it could not be maintained for too long. Beep 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 beep. A series of sharp alarms rang out. In the field of vision where the light was the brightest, a light purple mecha suddenly appeared. Under the blazing light, the two newest MX mecha of the Federation in the Kaki Mountains appeared even more holy in their white reflections, while the purple appeared even more demonic and murderous. After the two mecha had been transported out of the base, the distance between them was only 200 meters. For a cheetah, it would only take a few breaths to reach its prey. However, for a new mecha with dual-engine technology and 4 times the power output, this distance was actually a little frighteningly short. The Purple Sea mecha moved, its dual engines at full power. One moment it was still far away, the next it had already turned into a purple shadow and was charging over. The instant the little white flower mecha set foot on the surface of the moon, Su Li, who was completely focused, had discovered the figure of the purple mecha standing proudly in the light before the onboard radar. Being able to see it with the naked eye was naturally more direct than being able to see it with the radar. However, he had not expected that Madman Li, operating the Purple Sea mecha, would make his move so swiftly and valiantly. In fact, he had not even chosen to attack with long-range weapons right from the start, instead intending to engage in close-range mecha combat at close range. The right arm of the white mecha had long been raised horizontally, and the hanging weapons mounted on the side of the mecha's arm began to spew wildly. However, the firepower systems of both mecha had already been modified by the final assembly base into low-light marking weapons used in training exercises. In addition, there was no air on the surface of the moon, so it was very difficult to hear those crisp and beautiful clicking sounds. However, at the same time that the little white flower mecha launched its long-range attack, the purple sea mecha, which was charging forward at unparalleled speed, made a preemptive judgment. Its heavy mechanical legs stomped viciously on a protruding moon rock, and the mecha's body moved in an extremely strange and powerful manner as it forcefully turned to avoid those beams of light that represented lethality, preventing the sensors on the mecha's body from receiving any signal of damage. In just an instant, the purple sea mecha had already broken through the blockade of long-range firepower and arrived in front of Su Lo. Without hesitation, it silently and coldly used its hard alloy fists to punch towards the abdomen of the little white flower mecha. The massive inertia of the heavy mecha, the strong initial start-up speed of the twin engines, and the evasive maneuverability under quadruple power were all used to their fullest by Mad Manly, who was operating the purple sea mecha. Using the simplest of movements, it created the most dangerous moment. The purple sea mecha's advance had left behind a trail of light dust on the moon rock, but before it could even touch the purple surface of the mecha, the killing blow had arrived in an instant. A moment later, a cloud of dust had descended. Near the Kaki Mountains, countless data collectors had been installed. The mecha of both sides also had monitoring equipment installed by the final assembly base. In addition, there were 7 highly sensitive satellites positioned above the polar regions of the old moon. These equipment faithfully transmitted everything that happened on the battlefield back to the conference room at the old moon base, as well as to the command hall on Planet S1 hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The instant the electronic countdown ended, everyone in the command hall fell silent for a moment. They stared at the 2 new mechas standing 200 meters apart on the giant screen. No one spoke, not even making a sound. No matter which side the technicians in the command hall belonged to, no matter which side those big shots watching the battle supported, at least in this moment, they all had the same feeling. No matter what standard the Federation adopted for the new mecha, and no matter what the competing interests behind the scenes were, at least they were very honored to be able to witness the first real battle of the Federation's epic-making new mecha. The light on the screen was very intense, but the white and purple of the 2 mechas' exterior appeared even more intense due to the reflection of the light. The people in the command hall stared unblinkingly at the screen. Only after a moment did those technicians come to their senses and prepare to begin data collection. This was the first real battle of the new MX mecha. The technical parameters displayed by both sides in this battle would not only serve as a judgment for any possible disputes, but more importantly, this was a good opportunity for the Federation to collect data on the mecha. However, the technicians did not have time to do the work of data collection, nor did they have time to use the data to analyze the operating efficiency of the MX mecha's 3 major systems in a vacuum environment. Thus, they could only turn their gazes back to the screen. Because the purple sea mecha had moved, and the moment it moved with such power that it could swallow mountains and rivers, full of dominance. Its speed was unimaginably fast. The Federation had been developing mecha for many years. Mecha were renowned for their high mobility, but no one had ever imagined that on the craggy surface environment of the old moon, a mecha could actually display such terrifying speed. This sort of instantaneous activation speed and the wondrous acceleration that followed, could it be the change brought about by the twin engines? Everyone was aware of this point, but no one had time to sigh. Because everything had happened too quickly, the roar of the purple sea mecha's twin engines could not be collected. However, the people in the command hall felt as if they were on the old moon, watching the purple sea mecha roar away with their own eyes, as fast as lightning. Using this sort of speed to display a revolutionary breakthrough in mecha development. Shang Qiu stared wide-eyed and slack-jawed at the purple mecha charging forward at high speed on the screen, her hands gripping her pen tightly. As a key figure in the formation of dual-engine technology, she knew better than anyone else just what kind of speed a mecha could reach when the dual-engine technology was operating at full power. However, that was just data from the laboratory, tests under a simulated environment. Today, seeing the dual-engine mecha in action for real, she was still so shocked that she could not find words to describe it. Speed! the only thing that determined a mecha's performance and close combat power could only be speed. On the screen, the white mecha tried to use long-range firepower to seal off the path of the purple mecha. However, in the face of the terrifying speed of the purple sea mecha and the valiant operation of the pilot, the few weak beams of light that represented the firing line appeared so futile and weak. This was the frightening part of the new twin-engine mecha. Under the protection of super mobility, the inherent firepower system of the universe was already outdated. If the firing speed of mechanical weapons and the tracking speed of standard missiles could no longer match the instantaneous evasive speed of the mecha, then how could they injure or destroy it? The high-speed movement of the purple sea mecha on the holographic screen, leaving behind only an afterimage, made clear to everyone in the Old Moon Base's conference room and command hall a fact. In future battles, unless it was a concentrated firepower or a precise beam attack from a battleship, the MX mecha would be a super weapon that would be very difficult to surround or defeat. The instinctive excitement of an engineer flashed through Shang Qiu's mind. She stared blankly at the screen. Her fingers had not yet finished exerting force when she saw the purple sea mecha charging in front of Little White Flower. She was very worried whether the Nutshell MX mecha would be defeated by this attack. But what shocked her even more was that the pilot controlling the Purple Sea had only used 2 days and 2 nights to master the control system of the twin-engine mecha to such perfection. He had completely taken advantage of the speed advantage of the new MX mecha, abandoning the original federal military mecha movements to pursue close combat instead of long-range attacks. The Lees of Philadelphia were indeed geniuses on the battlefield. Only a genius mecha warrior would dare to completely abandon the original mecha control method in his first real battle and rely on his instincts to change his battle strategy at the last minute to maximize the mobility of the twin-engine mecha. This choice undoubtedly proved that the crazy person in the Purple Sea mecha had extraordinary calmness and strong confidence in himself. The officers and technicians in the command hall who were watching the screen stared dumbfoundedly at the brilliant purple light. Looking at the speed of the mecha that the Federation had never produced before, they did not have time to react. They did not have time to analyze any data before they subconsciously made a judgment. The battle between the two MX mecha seemed to have just started and was about to end. The military bigwigs behind the command hall who stood up after being shocked by the speed of the Purple Sea mecha were also thinking the same thing. Even if the Nutshell pilot was the best ace pilot in the federal military, in the face of the violent and swift attacks of the Purple Sea mecha, he would definitely not be able to make the most correct response. The white mecha that was obviously still defending against long-range attacks and close combat would be like its codename Little White Flower in the next moment, swaying and shattering in the vacuum of Old Moon Mount Kaki. The strong mechanical arm took up a quarter of the field of vision. The glossy purple exterior reflected the light of the stars. The fiercely contracting joint components and transmission pipes were so clear and were getting bigger and bigger. Su Le had always thought that Madman Li had only been in contact with the MX mecha for 2 days and could not be more familiar with it than himself. But seeing this scene, he knew that he was wrong. Under such circumstances, even the fastest reaction speed of a federal military pilot would not be able to allow Little White Flower to make the correct response. But he could, because his nerves were thicker than others, and his reaction was faster than others. In the dark cockpit, his fingers quickly swept across the screen, and at the same time, the warm energy in his body also burst forth in an instant. Through the simulation system on his body, it sent precise signals to every component of the mecha. The alloy fist of the Purple Sea mecha was enough to defeat the enemy in one hit. With the huge force and high speed of the sprint, it seemed impossible to dodge. So Little White Flower did not dodge. Instead, at the moment when the alloy fist was about to hit its body, its left mechanical leg stepped back and its right mechanical arm struck out as fast as lightning. In a vacuum environment, the alloy fist of the Purple Sea mecha could not make the sound of air exploding. But that fist that broke through the air and landed in the eyes of everyone watching the foot of Mount Kaki, was mixed with endless dominance and murderous intent. Little White Flower's mecha moved, but its movement was hurried and helpless. As if it had been blown by a strong wind, its waist twisted slightly. But it was this seemingly helpless twist that the Purple Sea mecha's fist, which had been charging up for a long time, brushed past the left side of the white mecha's chest and collided directly with that mechanical arm that had appeared out of nowhere. The two strong alloy fists collided heavily. In this instant, it seemed that the hard alloy surface could be seen slowly deforming under this impact, revealing the complex internal components. When the mecha collided, there was no sound. This scene fell into everyone's eyes like a clap of thunder, waking everyone up. Non-standard movements. In the ground command hall, the invited dean of the 1st Military Academy's mobility department leaned on the railing, his eyes narrowed as he watched the two mecha collide for the first time on the holographic screen. He said in a low voice, "All non-standard movements." No one paid attention to what he was saying. Everyone was staring at the holographic screen, dumbfounded. If it was said that Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng, who was piloting the Purple Sea mecha, was able to use the new MX mecha's functions to the maximum in a short period of time because of his identity as the descendant of the war god, this was an amazing but acceptable feat. But the pilot sent by the Nutshell Company to operate the white mecha was actually able to make an effective response in such a short period of time. Although it was a bit embarrassing, it had successfully blocked the Purple Sea mecha's domineering attack. This made everyone unable to believe their own eyes. How fast is the hand speed required to do this? Most of the people in the command hall were professionals. Although they had not personally operated the new mecha, they knew that under the Purple Sea mecha's domineering attack, the reaction time left for the white mecha pilot was very short. To be able to continuously input commands to operate the mecha to make the only feasible response in such a short period of time, what kind of hand speed and vision did this require? Chapter 250. When the federal military operated the M-series mecha, they had always strictly adhered to military mecha operating regulations. This was because the cruel reality of the battlefield had long proven that any tactical maneuvers that went beyond the regulations could only become a flashy dance of death in battle. Military mecha were tall and heavy metal existences. They resembled humans, but could not be real humans. To control this giant battle machine through those complicated circuitry components, those cumbersome regulations were precisely the most efficient method. In the command hall, the head of the 1st Academy's mobility department stared blankly at the screen. This was because he knew very well that from the high-speed start of the Purple Sea mecha to the unbelievable hand speed of the Little White Flower mecha, whether it was the way it moved or the combat techniques, the mecha operating methods of the two pilots were completely different from what he had been taught for decades. Twin engines, 4 times the power, and unprecedented mobility made the new MX mecha a brand new existence. He had already thought beforehand that the operation of the new mecha would definitely change, but he had not expected that it would require a brand new operating method to be able to unleash the power of this new mecha. War god Li Pifu had once single-handedly killed his way into enemy lines, using an old M-series mecha to kill the Emperor of the Empire, and then retreated bathed in blood. In fact, many people in the military knew that the war god's mecha operating methods were definitely different from those of the so-called ace pilots. However, this method could not be learned, and it could not be used on the old M-series mecha. Until today, when the new mecha battled, a brand new world appeared before everyone's eyes. The people in the command hall vaguely caught something, but it was not clear enough. Only the head of the mobility department had thought of this point first. From now on, the federal military would have to train a new batch of pilots. A revolutionary mecha would require revolutionary operating methods. The fact that the white mecha from Nutshell Company had actually survived a fierce attack from the Purple Sea mecha shocked everyone in the command hall. Everyone felt a trace of admiration for the pilot in the white mecha. Shang Qiu looked at the white mecha on the screen in confusion. Suddenly, she felt that this incomparably familiar MX mecha had actually become somewhat unfamiliar. She knew that it should be Zhou Yu inside the mecha, but the problem was that she had worked with Zhou Yu for a long time. She knew very well that this gentle and elegant man's mecha operating style was definitely not this silent. Yes, silent was used to describe his style. It meant that he was so calm that he did not care about anything. At the foot of Old Moon Kaki mountain range, there was a cloud of dust. 2 MX mecha were fighting at high speed. The speed of the mecha was so fast that it was hard to see clearly in the cloud of dust. In the vacuum environment, it was quiet, and there were no sounds of collisions. Only the occasional sparks and tremors of the earth could be heard. The 3 fingers on Su Li's left hand quickly pressed on the accelerator button, feeling the intense vibrations of the mecha. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen in his helmet, continuously controlling the mecha through the touchscreen input and simulation system, dodging wave after wave of attacks from the Purple Sea, each stronger than the last. Only after direct contact did he realize how terrifying the Purple Sea mecha that Madman Li was piloting was. The mobility of the new dual-engine mecha had been pushed to the limit by that person. From the moment they met, the other had not given him any chance to catch his breath. His alloy fists were laced with a heroic aura, smashing through every weak spot of his mecha from tricky paths. If he had not performed above his usual standards at the very beginning, the little white flower mecha would probably have long been struck down by the Purple Sea, only to be humiliated by the other. The battle between the 2 new mecha was in reality no longer the mecha battle mode of the past. Instead, it was more like a close combat battle between military experts. It was also like those Jianghu disciples wielding large swords in the dark of the night, filled with a bloody and direct style. The problem was that the Purple Sea piloted by Madman Li was perfectly displaying the speed of the new mecha. Using standard and perfect tactical movements, he made absolutely non-standard continuous attacks, striking out with the force of a great river, surging without rest, clean and efficient, open and closed, incomparably heroic, its domineering aura filled with a crazed air. Faced with such a terrifying purple mecha, the white mecha at the foot of the mountain was completely at a disadvantage after luckily escaping the first wave of attacks. There was no room for retaliation at all. He was no match for Madman Li. At this moment, Su Lu recalled what Bai Yulan had once said to him in the underground base. If you encounter Madman Li in a mecha, you had best avoid him as soon as possible. In the past, he had not understood this saying very well, but at this moment, watching the purple mecha's intimidating and oppressive attacks under the illumination of the screen, he finally understood more. This 16-year-old lieutenant colonel of the Federation seemed to be a person born for mecha combat, and the new dual-engine mecha seemed to be a combat tool designed for people like him. In just 2 days and 2 nights, Madman Li had already become one with that purple mecha. His control was perfect, clean and swift. He dodged and weaved in and out of the way like a gust of wind, making people feel suffocated. The alloy fist scraped across the surface of the mecha, leaving a deep gash. The sharp armor-piercing blade extended from the spherical joint and slashed towards the left side of the white mecha, where the central control chip was located. The white mecha twisted its body forcefully in this desperate situation, its 2 thick mechanical legs moving in standard steps as it retreated backwards. Sparks sprang up on the surface of the mecha, and then were quickly extinguished in the oxygen-free environment like a string of shooting stars. The close-range weapons of the mecha blocked each other, and from time to time, terrible cracks appeared on the hard alloy surface. From the looks of it, the Purple Sea mecha had already gained an overwhelming advantage. However, what was strange was that every time the Purple Sea mecha was about to hit a vital point, the white mecha seemed to be able to predict where the Purple Sea mecha's next attack would come from and dodge in advance. From the start of the battle until now, it had actually only been less than 30 seconds, but the Purple Sea mecha had already completed countless dazzling non-standard mecha combat moves, causing great damage to the white mecha's body. However, the white mecha had still not been knocked down. Whether it was the people watching the battle in the command hall or the aloofly phone controlling the Purple Sea mecha himself, all of them felt a sliver of doubt towards this situation. Who was the pilot of the nutshell mecha? How was he able to withstand the violent and high-speed attacks of the descendant of the Fey City god of war under such circumstances? The exterior of the little white flower mecha was full of scars, and occasionally, black liquid would spurt out. It looked like it was in a mess, but it did not suffer any fatal attacks. It fought and retreated at the foot of Kaki Mountain, and it seemed to be able to keep up with the operating speed of the Purple Sea mecha. The data sent back to the command hall also proved this point. Although the hand speed of the pilot could not reach the explosive speed at the very beginning, it was still amazingly fast. However, if the battle continued like this, the mecha that was swaying like a white flower under the barren hills of Old Moon would not be able to hold on for long. Defeat seemed to be a foregone conclusion. The people in the Old Moon base and the command hall could not hear anything, but they could see these shocking scenes. The two young people who were in the mecha could clearly feel every vibration of the mecha, and every damage. Right then, all of Su Li's mind and willpower were focused on operating the mecha. The scorching lines on his body raced at high speed, helping him to push the white mecha's speed to the maximum through the simulation system. Only then could he fully utilize the full power of the little white flower's twin engines. Even so, facing the wild attacks of the Purple Sea mecha, he still felt as if there was a huge wave crashing towards him, as if it could drown him at any time. He did not know what level of hand speed the simulation system he was using was equivalent to among the Federation pilots. He also did not know that the white mecha he was controlling was not a standard action. He could only follow his own instincts to capture the traces of the Purple Sea mecha's violent and frightening attacks, controlling the white mecha to follow the 10 stances he was most familiar with. In Section H1 of Lihua University's library, he had conducted many Level 6 mecha training exercises alone. Later on, he had also followed by Yulan to learn the standard federal military tactical movements. But in this moment, in front of Madman Li's mecha, he had forgotten all of this. He had to forget. He could only follow the moves he was most familiar with, turning the little white flower's mecha into his own. Bent elbows, thrust knees, parry horizontally, advance. Heroism against heroism. Plus, for some reason, Sula felt that the combat moves of the Purple Sea mecha were somewhat familiar. It was as if he had been born knowing where the opponent would attack from. That was why the white mecha he was controlling was able to hold on bitterly under the opponent's violent attacks. In this instant, he suddenly understood that if it had been anyone else, such as Bai Yulan or Zhou Yu, they would probably not have been able to cope under the terrifying attacks of Madman Li and the dual-engine mecha combined into one. That Purple Sea mecha gave people the feeling that it was undefeatable. But Su Lu remained calm. He steadily and quickly entered the commands, adjusting the signals emitted by his body so that every move of the little white flower's mecha would become more accurate and powerful. Uncle Feng Yu admired Su Li's calmness the most. This admiration was even greater than his admiration for Su Li's mechanical engineering talent. This young man, Su Lu, seemed to have been born with a rock. No matter what kind of difficult situation he was in, he would always maintain a clear train of thought. The twin engines of the Purple Sea mecha provided great power. Under the Khaki Mountains, the mecha twisted its body abruptly and avoided the little white flower's block. In an instant, it had advanced behind Little White Flower and smashed its alloy fists towards the defenseless head of the mecha. The head of the mecha was equipped with sophisticated information acquisition equipment, a fire control radar, and a balancing device. If it was subjected to such a violent attack, the moment these equipment failed, the outcome of the battle was obvious. The Purple Sea mecha's twist and step had been so clean and efficient that there had been no sloppiness. Moreover, it had completely controlled the reaction of the white mecha at that moment. In terms of timing, the battle-hardened Madman Li in the cockpit of the Purple Sea was clearly of the highest standard in the Federal Army. The situation had reached its most critical moment. This is the moment. At the same time that the onboard computer gave the location warning signal, or even a few tenths of a second earlier, Sula had already made his move. The white mecha's block action had not been completed. 3 power units were simultaneously output, and the joint engine of the left mechanical leg was forcibly shut down. The hydraulic system completed a cold compression in an instant, and because of this extremely complex action, the entire mecha lurched to the left. The Purple Sea mecha's fist brushed past the white mecha's head and smashed heavily into the left shoulder of the white mecha. The white mecha's shoulder armor instantly tilted up and splashed. The tremendous force of the impact caused the white mecha to fall to the left. But it did not fall. This was because the left arm of the white mech had already reacted in advance, supporting the heavily weathered surface of the moon. Using this tremendous force, the huge body of the white mech began to spin in the air. The heavy mechanical leg drew an arc in the air, then bounced back with incomparable speed, violently smashing into the head of the Purple Sea mech. This was the first time since the start of the battle that Little White Flower had truly struck the vital point of the Purple Sea mecha. In the command hall, the head of the maneuver department of Number 1 Hospital had just sat down with a complicated expression when he saw this scene on the huge holographic screen. He stood up abruptly and stared in disbelief at the action of Little White Flower's mecha on the holographic screen. Mechanical arm propped up on the ground, mechanical leg rebounded and struck directly at the vital point of the opponent's mecha. Was this something that a mecha could do? This was more like the close combat techniques of the strong people in the body cultivation halls. The pilots of the federal military might have done this kind of action on a normal day, but in a real mecha battle, which mecha would dare to do this kind of action in an extremely short period of time? Only the superpower of the twin engines could ensure that a heavy mecha could carry out such a nimble attack. The head of the department stared in shock at the white mecha's sharp attack in mid-air on the holographic screen. Before he had time to sigh with emotion, he found that today's battle between the new mecha had once again given him a shock in terms of concept. At the same time that Little White Flower's flying kick struck the Purple Sea's head, the Purple Sea mecha's twin engines activated at full speed and actually reacted at the same time. There was no time to retract the alloy fist that had struck out, but the Purple Sea mecha's mechanical leg bent at the same time. Relying on the power provided by the jet stream, it slid through the air, and the hard joints of the mechanical leg struck the white mecha's abdomen viciously. The Purple Sea mecha charged forward violently, and the white mecha kicked back sharply. The moment the two sides came into contact, a huge force was unleashed at the same time, and both sides were sent flying back more than 20 meters. The heavily weathered surface of the moon was thrown into a cloud of dust by this attack, and it did not settle for a long time. The upper half of the Purple Sea mecha was severely damaged, and there was a terrible crack. Not far away, the white mecha was even more damaged. The outer armor structure of its abdomen was clearly deformed. The two mecha stood tens of meters apart, and in the middle of the moon's surface, the deep imprint of a mechanical palm was very obvious. Chapter 251. Machine Number 1, Kinetic Energy Output Normal. Engine Auxiliary Computer Parameters Anormal, Fire Control Radar Ineffective. Information Capture System 46% Delay. Main Firepower System Energy Transfer Complete. Machine Number 2, Energy Input System Damaged, Degree Unknown. Onboard computer has abnormal parameters. Belly engine room damaged, leakage situation occurring. Main Firepower System Energy Transfer Complete. The battle of the new MX mecha on Old Moon had been going on for so long, but the computer system in the command hall had only just finished analyzing the data for the first time. It wasn't that Madman Li and Su Lu, who were piloting the mecha, had already made the dual-engine mecha's battle speed exceed the computer's calculation range. It was just that the battle situation had been so intense that the people in the command hall simply had no time to deal with these things. Machine Number 1 was the Purple Sea developed by the Federal Academy of Science. Machine Number 2 was the Little White Flower developed by the Shell Motor Company. Hearing the electronically synthesized female voice report the damage of both sides, the people in the command hall each had a different expression. The previous battle had already shown that in a face-to-face battle with the new mecha, the long-range weapon system could no longer be used to its full potential. Therefore, whether it was Li Feng operating the Purple Sea or Su Lu operating the Little White Flower, they had all transferred the backup energy of the main firepower system to the mobility aspect at the first opportunity. The decisive choice of the two pilots under Mount Kaki, as well as the courage, confidence, and decisiveness contained in this choice, made the professionals in the command hall feel an unnatural chill. Starting acceleration data, MDX control efficiency parameters, joint engine platinum clutch spacing. Following the appearance of various numerical units, the battle data of the new MX mecha hundreds of thousands of kilometers away was transmitted back to the command hall of Planet S1 through the first level of the electronic monitoring network. One only needed to perform a simple comparison of data to discover that the Purple Sea mecha developed by the Federation's Academy of Sciences had an overall advantage, especially in terms of the power output of the main twin engines, which had an overflow value of close to 10%. In a mecha battle, such a large difference in power output was enough to determine victory and defeat. In the right half of the command hall, the Academy of Science experts had calm and confident expressions. The technicians of the Shell Motor Company on the left looked at the data flashing below the giant holographic screen. Their expressions were somewhat grave. The Purple Sea mecha had the advantage in terms of performance, and it was obvious that although the pilot piloting the Little White Flower mecha was also very capable, under Madman Lee's ferocious attacks, he still paled in comparison. With the two added together, the people in the command hall all thought that the Purple Sea mecha from the Academy of Sciences would win. The head of the maneuver department of No. 1 Hospital pulled up the visual data of the pilot's control. Looking at the data of the two pilots' hand speed on the screen, his pupils could not help but shrink. It was understandable that Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, could reach such a frightening hand speed. Who knew which ace pilot the Nutshell Company had poached from the military? His hand speed was also frightening. Just as the people in the command hall found the rare time to analyze the mecha data of both sides, the image on the giant screen changed once more. The Purple Sea mecha seemed to not know fatigue at all, and did not care about the damage to its head. After pausing for a moment on the spot, it turned into a beautiful purple light and stepped on the soft surface of the moon, rushing towards the Little White Flower. The white mecha was like a fragile flower. There were already many cracks on its exterior. Facing the Purple Sea's attack again, this mecha made a response that no one had expected. Under the blazing light, the Little White Flower mecha's two engines were fully activated. In an instant, it reached the peak of 4 times its original power. 2 smooth auxiliary flying wings slid out from the back of the mecha's waist. As the small jets under the auxiliary flying wings spat out air, the white mecha's figure shook violently. Following the surface of the weathered surface, it quickly flashed towards the back. With the help of the auxiliary flying wings, the MX mecha from the Nutshell Company displayed its highest speed for the first time. It was as if a gust of wind had blown past it, instantly disappearing into the large shadow behind it. That was the shadow of the Kachi mountain range. On the other side, the Purple Sea mecha was still in mid-air, executing an extremely fierce mecha attack maneuver. However, in response to the sudden change in the white mecha, the Purple Sea mecha spread out its auxiliary flying wings and glided down from a height of 10 meters in the air. Using the momentum, the Purple Sea mecha forcefully accelerated, and just as it was about to land on the ground, the Purple Sea mecha changed the direction of its descent to smoothly chase after that patch of shadows. Little White Flower and Purple Sea, one in front and one behind, were like 2 shooting stars traversing the vast universe. They flashed across the screen and disappeared without a trace. The comprehensive surveillance system only took 0.017 seconds to capture the 2 MX mecha's figures. The high-sensitivity satellite above the polar region of the Old Moon was faithfully watching the 2 mecha moving quickly in the shadows of the Kachi mountain range. These images were transmitted to the eyes of the spectators. Today's MX mecha battle test had greatly stimulated the spectators in the command hall of the Old Moon base. For those military representatives who had been immersed in mecha piloting for decades, the way the Purple Sea mecha operated and the strange movements of Little White Flower's mecha as it dodged were the source of their shock. For those mechanics experts and engineers, the performance of these 2 new MX mecha was the real reason why they were dumbfounded. Especially when the 2 mecha, one in front and one behind, extended their auxiliary flying wings at almost the same time, instantly raising the speed of the mecha to a level never before seen in the Federation mecha. Everyone gasped in surprise. The experts from the Shell Motor Company and the Federal Academy of Science had long simulated and even seen with their own eyes how terrifying the absolute speed of the MX mecha was with the assistance of the auxiliary flying wings. But today, witnessing with their own eyes the appearance of this kind of speed in the distant Old Moon base, they still found it hard to contain their excitement. After the excitement, there was a natural round of applause. Everyone on and off the stage stood up and began to clap, moved and proud by the revolutionary breakthrough of the Federation mecha. On the huge widescreen screen, the 2 mecha were operating at full power, switching from combat mode to running mode. They were running at full speed through the rugged Old Moon mountain range without any footholds. This scene was filled with a thrilling sense of beauty. And in sync with the tense atmosphere on the screen, the various data being fed back to the command hall also began to rise again. CLK is moving up in a curve. CLS is approaching its peak. ADS adaptive suspension entering a passive wear and tear period. Not everyone in the command hall could understand these technical terms, but those important figures heard the electronic synchronized sound become more hurried. Their hearts also became nervous. Looking at the graphical color bar graph on one side of the large screen, they knew that the power output of the 2MX mecha on Kachi Mountain was getting higher and higher, almost reaching its limit. Another 2 minutes passed. The data fed back to the ground clearly showed that the power output of the 2 mecha was constantly fluctuating around its peak. Shang Qiu gripped the pen in her hand tightly, staring at the graphic display on the monitor in front of her. Her full breasts rose and fell continuously due to her rapid breathing. She was a calm engineer, but at this moment, she could no longer remain calm. She did not understand the specific reason, but she had already guessed that the person inside the little white flower mecha should be Su Lu. This was because only Su Lu, herself, and Bai Yulan knew the biggest flaw of the Purple Sea mecha. Now that Bai Yulan had already been arrested by the Bureau of Proclamation, other than Su Lu, who else would still throw caution to the wind and use Kachi Mountain Range to speed up and bring the Purple Sea mecha into overclocking mode? However, at this time, the Purple Sea mecha on the screen kept its distance from the little white flower mecha in front of it, maintaining the power output of its twin engines near its peak. Occasionally, it would enter overclocking mode for 1 or 2 seconds before automatically lowering its power output. The Purple Sea mecha seemed to rather not catch up to the little white flower mecha than forcefully increase its speed at this time. Could it be that the Academy of Science has found out? Shang Qiu subconsciously used the tip of her pen to scratch her itchy forehead, completely oblivious to the light blue ink smeared on the side of her eyebrows. The mecha control techniques he had painstakingly studied in the past, under the pressure of the Purple Sea mecha behind him, were almost like those 10 stances, becoming instinctive to his body. It was only in this way that he could rely on the simulation system and those combat stances to last until now in the face of Madman Li's terrifying strength. However, the Purple Sea mecha chasing behind him cast a shadow over Su Li's heart. The murderous aura on that mecha was so intimidating that it actually made one feel as if they could not win. Earlier, on the weathered surface at the foot of the mountain, Little White Flower's mecha had kicked backwards in the air, successfully destroying the complex fire control system at the head of the Purple Sea mecha. However, no one had expected that the Purple Sea mecha would actually be able to skillfully control its power system in midair. It abruptly moved horizontally, and its mechanical leg bent horizontally to strike Little White Flower's abdomen. It looked like both sides had suffered damage, but Su Lu knew that he had made a big mistake. Compared to Madman Li and the Purple Sea mecha, Su Lu did not have any advantage in mecha piloting. Even with the help of the simulation system, he still could not compare to that young lieutenant colonel who had been immersed in mecha piloting since he was a child. The only area in which he was better than Madman Li was his deep understanding of mecha structures. From the time he had repaired the old M mecha on the Ancient Bell, all the way until he had entered the Shell Engineering Division to help with the creation of the MX mecha, he could not be more familiar with every component, every circuit, every chipset, and every position of every transmission rod in a mecha. However, it was precisely because of this habitual thinking that Su Lu had chosen to target the head of the Purple Sea mecha, which had been integrated with most of its information capture system, when the white mecha had taken the risk to strike at the foot of the mountain. However, Madman Li did not seem to care about this at all. He brutally and domineeringly traded injury for injury. It was not until the dust had settled and the palm print had landed on the ground that Su Lu understood that the most terrifying destructive power of the MX mecha was in close combat. The fire control radar was no longer as important as it had been in the past. Meanwhile, in order to destroy the opponent's fire control radar, Little White Flower's mecha had paid the price of damaging its energy transmission system. Rocks slid down the mountain. In the darkness, the white mecha quickly and accurately found another point to leverage on. Its nimble mechanical alloy toes dug into the crevices of the rocks, and with the silent vibration of the engine and the white turbulence of the auxiliary wing jets, the body of the mecha suddenly shot up. It came to a gentle slope and charged upwards. The weathered sand and stones on the slope of the valley were silently disintegrated by the heavy body of the mecha, constantly trembling and undulating. In a situation where the maximum power output was at a disadvantage, the Shell Engineering Division's little white flower mecha still possessed a speed that did not lose out to the Purple Sea mecha. On one hand, it relied on Shang Qiutian's dynamic design. On the other hand, it also proved that the Shell Engineering Division was indeed worthy of its reputation as a mecha designer for the federal military. In the field of mecha design, it was still ahead of the Academy of Science. The chase between Little White and the Purple Sea mecha had already lasted for more than 10 minutes. The harsh environment of ultra-low temperature did not seem to affect the performance of the two MX mecha. Their speed was still extremely fast, and the distance between them was still maintained extremely well. Su Lu breathed heavily. He focused on controlling Little White Flower to perform one difficult movement after another. His control became more and more practiced, but his heart became heavier and heavier. He had never imagined that he could control a mecha and truly defeat Mad Manly, but he knew some things that Mad Manly did not know. He had been waiting for the other to enter overclocking mode, but why was the Purple Sea mecha behind him not willing to forcefully increase its speed and catch up to him? The low-temperature vacuum environment was extremely disadvantageous for the MX's energy consumption. Mad Manly in the Purple Sea had been through hundreds of battles. It was impossible for him not to know this. Why was he willing to drag it out like this? The blazing light of the stars shone over the top of the mountain and into the mecha's field of vision, dispelling the cold and darkness. Little White Flower's mecha did a high-speed somersault to the top of the mountain. Then it turned back. What does he want to do? The giant screen showed the image of Little White Flower's mecha leaping to the top of Mount Kaki and then turning back. No one knew how the Federation's electronic surveillance system did it, but the real-time image on the screen had a very high resolution rate. The angle of view was also very beautiful. It was obvious that it was not captured by a high-altitude satellite. The mecha chase that lasted for more than 10 minutes seemed to be a little dull. This was originally a silent battle, but the performance of the two mecha at the foot of the mountain and their exquisite control was enough to excite the audience. In these 10 minutes, in the shadows of Mount Kaki, only the white and purple mecha could be seen moving forward at high speed. This went on for a very long time. The data and computer analysis already showed the people in the command hall and Old Moon Assembly Base that the Academy of Science's Purple Sea mecha had the upper hand. As for Little White Flower's mecha running up the mountain, everyone was shocked, but they also gradually understood the thoughts of the pilot. Until now, there were still not many people who knew that the pilot in the white mecha was a technical supervisor. They all thought that the pilot must also be an absolutely outstanding ace pilot of the Federation military. Thus, when the image of the white mecha braking and turning around appeared on the screen, everyone felt a strong sense of suspicion. Faced with the overwhelming advantage of the Purple Sea mecha and Li Feng's unstoppable attacks, why would this unknown ace pilot give up the rare balance of speed and stop at the top of the mountain? At this point in the battle, the Federal Academy of Science's Purple Sea mecha's performance advantage was shown, so the engineers in the command hall were very calm. Shang Qiu, who had a few traces of blue ink at the corner of his eyebrows, looked in that direction, then turned back to look at Lin Yuanhu behind him. Seeing the old man's calm and confident expression, he could not help but snort coldly in his heart. The performance of the Purple Sea mecha depended on its design, and the function model that the design was based on had a parameter error. The MX designed by Nutshell Company was to fix that parameter error, and a part of its performance was sacrificed. No one in the command hall knew this better than Shang Qiu, but the situation was one-sided, and even if she wanted to put on a confident expression, it was extremely difficult. She only knew that Little White Flower was standing at the top of Mount Kaki and turning back. He must be thinking of a way to drag the Purple Sea into overclocking, but she did not know what that guy was going to do. Suddenly, a middle-aged expert beside her touched her shoulder and said hurriedly, "What is Little White Flower doing?" Shang Qiu quickly turned to look at the screen, and her red lips could not help but open slightly. Like everyone in the command hall, she let out an exaggerated gasp. On the giant screen, the white mecha's mechanical arm extended a repair arm from the front, pressing against the heavily damaged abdomen of the mecha, as if some kind of repair work was being done. Chapter 252. Shang Qiu subconsciously covered her mouth. She knew that Little White Flower MX had some spare parts under its cockpit, but she never would have thought that the pilot would actually choose to repair himself at this time when Little White Flower stood trembling on the peak and the Purple Sea would attack in an instant. Strength was gained through hard work, but confidence was gained through actual combat. At this point in the battle, Sulu was deeply impressed by Madman Li's unfathomable mecha control ability. At the same time, he also gained a lot of confidence in himself. At this moment, he finally understood that those days when he was tortured beyond recognition by the Level 6 virtual reality test in Area H1 of Lihua University were not in vain. At the beginning of the year, from Tai Ziyuan's words, he already knew how frightening the Level 6 mecha test was. He believed that his control method using the simulation system, if converted to hand speed, should already be close to the standard of an ace pilot in the military. In addition to the high-intensity mecha operation training he had undergone some time ago in the Whitewater underground base on the outskirts of the capital, he believed in his own mecha control ability. Because of this confidence, Sulu had listened to Bai Yulan's soft instructions before she left and temporarily replaced Zhou Yu's pilot position. Unfortunately, Madman Li was stronger, extraordinarily strong. The youth who entered the Purple Sea mecha was even scarier than his violent and tyrannical self. There were clearly dozens of tons of metal between them, but it could not stop that person from displaying his murderous aura through the ice-cold machine. At this time, Sulu would rather fight the opponent one-on-one with his fists and legs than face him in a mecha. At this moment, he could not help but think of that imperial princess Tai Ziyuan had mentioned. She had entered the realm of level 6 at the age of 12. Madman Li had also entered the battlefield at the age of 12. Could it be that this world really had monsters who were born with knowledge? The thing that made Sulu feel the most vigilant, the fact that even his heart that was as hard as a rock was somewhat shaken, was that the Purple Sea that had always been following behind him didn't enter an overclocking state and forcibly increase its speed to intercept him on the way to Kaki Peak like he had planned. Why did the Purple Sea, which had been so crazy and violent before, suddenly become so calm and indifferent? His ruthless style coupled with his absolutely calm thinking, and the fact that he was only 16 years old, this type of opponent was truly too frightening. The Lees of Philadelphia, the god of war, the old man, and the uncles, were all the monsters in this universe related to them? When he was thinking about these things, Sulu was not like the ancient swordsman who stood on the peak and waited for the arrival of the Purple Sea mecha. He was a youth with 3 qualities who treated others in a traditional way, but he was not stupid enough to ask for a battle that involved killing, nor would he follow some kind of rigid rules. The Little White Flower mecha stood steadily on the edge of the platform at the peak. The long-range weapon on its left arm had already been switched on. Without the backup power of the firepower system, it was unable to activate the main cannon. However, the rotating barrel of the Darlin's gun continued to spray out those light dots that represented high-speed projectiles, continuously shooting towards the rugged path below the cliff. It was a pity that the gun barrel on the mecha's left arm did not have a clear clicking sound as an accompaniment. The low-light projectiles were also unable to shatter the weathered lunar mountain and bring more trouble to the figure of the Purple Sea mecha. The Purple Sea mecha silently and swiftly executed incomparably awesome evasive maneuvers on the cliff, dodging all of the projectiles that Little White Flower had shot out. Sulu had hoped that during the test, his long-range attacks would be able to hit the Purple Sea, or at least force the opponent off the peak. He had only hoped to delay the opponent from reaching the peak, and in reality, he had achieved this. The precise point of impact, as if he could predict the trajectory of the Purple Sea mecha's evasive maneuvers, made even Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, feel extremely troubled. By the time he neared the peak, another 3 minutes had already passed. In these 3 minutes, Little White Flower's right mechanical arm had not been idle. Instead, it had rapidly carried out self-repair work. In a typical mecha battle, it was simply impossible to give a mechanic any time to repair, but today, in the special environment of the Old Moon Kaki mountain range, the white mecha had managed to do this. This was because the one controlling it was Sulu. In terms of mecha piloting skills, Sulu was a far cry from Madman Li, but in terms of mecha repair ability, there really were not many people in the Federation who were better than him. The left mechanical arm fired accurately and quickly, while the right mechanical arm calmly carried out its repair work. Between movement and silence, the little white flowers mecha towering on the peak of the mountain gave all the spectators who could see this scene a very special feeling. Repairing mecha in the middle of a battle had already left the people in the ground command hall dumbfounded, and right now, the white mecha was clearly carrying out a double-layered operation. The difficulty of this kind of operation was obvious, but Sulu carried it out extremely smoothly. He used the simulation system in conjunction with the control stick and the touch screen to carry out these two operations at the same time, so it was not difficult to use them. That was why, from the start of the battle until now, even when he had such a good pursuit maneuver when he had entered the shadow region of the Kaki mountain range, Li Feng had used his steel-like nerves to forcefully control himself and this purple sea mecha beneath him. Nothing could be done to the extreme, and unless it was the most dangerous moment, Madman Li would definitely not allow himself to truly go crazy and use control methods that were beyond his control, such as overclocking. The pilot in the white mecha opposite him was very interesting. Li Feng looked at the opponent in his field of vision who seemed to be facing a great enemy, and the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. What was interesting was not because this person actually dared to self-repair in the middle of a fierce battle, but because at the foot of the mountain, this pilot was actually able to withstand the continuous attacks of the Purple Sea. Only Li Feng himself knew how frightening that series of ferocious attacks were. His family's legacy combined with this dual-engine high-power mecha, once they were combined, even he himself was a little shocked by the power they produced. He even thought that even the guy with the surname Tian that the brats in the Westwoods military often mentioned, or Commander Zhong personally piloted the mecha, under his previous series of attacks, he was afraid that he would not be able to withstand it. But the pilot in the nutshell had managed to withstand it. Although the blocking was extremely difficult, he had still managed to protect the important parts of the mecha. What made Li Feng even more wary was that he caught a trace of a familiar style from the non-standard tactical movements of the white mecha. It was different from his own style, but it always seemed to be able to predict his movements in advance. Moreover, every time the white mecha made a move, it was so accurate, as if it could perfectly coordinate with his own attacks. This guy is not bad. Li Feng made this evaluation of this pilot in his heart, and because of that trace of wariness in his heart, he secretly raised the other's danger level by another level. However, he had never thought of using this mecha battle test to do anything to this pilot, because he was very confident that the final victor would be him, and the Federal Army just happened to be in need of excellent pilots like the other. Right at this moment, a dark green indicator light in the cockpit of the mecha lit up. Li Feng glanced at it indifferently, and knew that this was the Federal military standard equipment, a short-range encrypted communication system. It was used by the military to carry out small-scale team cooperation under the enemy's electronic attacks. Admit defeat. At this time, on the desolate peak of Old Moon Mountain, the only one who could carry out a short-range encrypted communication between mecha was the white mecha opposite. Although Li Feng did not quite understand, he still spoke first, and with such a matter-of-fact tone, he said coldly, "The mecha is my strong suit, and the piloting is also my better. You don't have a chance." The other end of the communication system was silent for a few seconds, and then a slightly hoarse young voice rang out, "But I still want to tear down your house sign, and you still want to call me uncle." Chapter 253. Li Feng, who was in the cockpit of the Purple Sea mech, narrowed his eyes when he heard these two words. He knew who the pilot in the white mech in front of him was. Then, he fell silent. Ever since he had found out that he was going to participate in the MX mecha battle test, Li Feng had never bothered to find out who the nutshell mecha pilot was. Even though he had killed his way from the foot of Mount Kaki all the way to the peak, he still did not pay too much attention to this unknown pilot. Even if an ace pilot from the Empire suddenly appeared in the white mech, he would not be so surprised. When it came to opponents, Madman Li would always just defeat them and step on them. Since that was the case, what difference did it make who the opponent was? However, he would never have thought that the pilot in the white mech would actually be that skinny technical director. Li Feng did not know that Su Lu was now officially part of the federal military. He thought that he was still a civilian second lieutenant. From his perspective, Su Lu had once displayed exceptionally strong close combat abilities in Linyuan. However, fighting was always different from operating a mech. How could the other party be so strong in a mech? Li Feng's eyebrows furrowed. Through the distorted vision of his helmet, he looked at the quiet white mecha in front of him. The shock in his heart dissipated after a long time. He said coldly, "You really do surprise me. Since it's a bet between us, of course I have to defeat you personally. I don't think it's appropriate to let anyone else destroy the house sign of Philadelphia." Su Lu listened to Li Feng's voice from the communicator and said coldly. Waiting for him at the peak, revealing his identity, everything he did was just to provoke the other party. If things had gone according to the previous course of events, Su Lu knew that he was destined to be the loser of the mecha battle. If he wanted to infuriate Li Feng, who was absolutely calm in battle yet was able to display a crazed aura, other than that bet and the fact that he was in a mecha, he could not think of any other way. Li Feng frowned. He looked at the white mech in his field of vision and suddenly said, "You really surprised me. But congratulations, you've successfully provoked my desire to kill you." "That's my wish," Su Lu thought silently in his heart. Then, he heard Madman Li's cold voice from the communicator. "I don't know why you brought the mech to the peak, but I can tell you this. Before coming to the base, I've already looked at the surface features of the polar regions of Old Moon. On this peak, you have no way out. On this point, I've taken advantage of you." The successor of the Lees of Philadelphia had a special status in the federal military. Before coming to Old Moon, naturally, there were military staff members who had drawn up the terrain features of the battleground for Madman Li. Su Lu heard Madman Li admitted himself and felt a little complicated. Although this young genius lieutenant colonel was violent and arrogant, in a direct battle, he did not lose his integrity. Su Lu suddenly thought of his real intention of dragging the other into the overclocking battle. After a moment of silence, he stopped thinking about this problem and said, "Work hard. Actually, I'm only a few years older than you. I don't want to be your uncle." After saying this sentence full of mockery, Su Lu took 2 deep breaths, opened a safety valve beside the control stick, and lightly pressed the start button. Hearing the voice from the communicator, Madman Li's delicate features flashed with a trace of darkness. Su Li's voice was very calm, but it was this calmness that made Madman Li feel a trace of humiliation. "You want to tear down the Li family of Philadelphia? You want to humiliate me? You actually want to participate in the mecha battle personally?" Su Li's choice surprised him, but he also felt that it was a challenge. His delicate features gradually calmed down, but a cold murderous intent had already risen up like a burning fire. It followed his body and fingers, and transmitted to the heavy and huge purple sea mecha. The superclose encrypted conversation was not captured by satellites or electronic surveillance networks. Whether it was in the Old Moon base's viewing room or in the S1 Capital's command hall, there was no third person who could hear the conversation between Su Lu and Madman Li. The people watched the huge widescreen screen. On the screen, the purple sea mecha and the little white flower mecha stood at the peak of Cocky Peak, at the border between light and shadow. No one dared to blink. They did not know what kind of surprise the 2 powerful pilots inside these 2 latest MX mecha would bring them in the next moment. However, at this time, the people were only puzzled. After the purple sea mecha caught up to the peak, it did not immediately launch a wild attack like before. That little white flower mecha also did not escape in a wretched and delicate manner. The 2 mecha, each 7 meters tall, just stood silently on the peak, like 2 divine statues overlooking the mortal world. "What are they doing? Don't tell me they've run out of energy," asked an official in the command hall with a frown. The military bigwigs beside him ignored this official because they knew very well that the self-contained energy of the MX mecha was enough to support this new mecha for several hours of continuous battle. However, they did not mock this official, because looking at the two silent mecha on the screen, these military bigwigs also did not know what was going on. According to the battle style of the old war god, how could that brat Madmanly be so stupid as to pay attention to elegance in battle? Director Lin Yuanhu, who had been sitting quietly on the stage, suddenly leaned forward and then sat up straight. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the two silent mecha on the screen. He could vaguely guess what was going to happen next. He was not worried at all because he believed in the performance of the Purple Sea mecha and Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng's absolute strength. However, why did he feel a chill in his chest? Could it be that as he got older, he could no longer withstand stimulation? What's going on? On the left side of the command hall, the experts from the Nutshell Engineering Department stared blankly at the data and asked with some unease. Perhaps these two pilots sympathized with each other and could not help themselves. Shang Qiu said with a smile as she took a tissue from a staff member beside her and wiped the blue ink from the corner of her eyes. Seeing this scene, her heart finally relaxed a little. Although she did not know what had happened on the distant cocky peak of the old moon, it was clear that neither Su Lu nor Madmanly were willing to wait any longer. What happened? The crowd in the command hall was all discussing what was happening on the screen, but this voice was especially panicked and loud. The 1st Military Academy's Mobility Department director on the stage stood up abruptly again. He was the first to notice the abnormal situation of the two mecha on the peak. He pointed at the screen and shouted loudly at the engineering staff below. On the wide screen, although the temperature on the peak of Cocky Peak was high, because of the weathered rocks and white light, it appeared incomparably cold and desolate. The little white flower mecha and the purple sea mecha exhaled several extremely fine streams of air almost at the same time. Those milky white streams of air shot out quickly, just like the old-fashioned steam locomotives in museums, but also like two leaky old-fashioned boilers. The people watching this scene could not hear the sound on the peak of Cocky Peak, but they seemed to be able to hear the sizzling sound coming from beside their ears. That was the sound of the high-speed streams of air. The fine white streams of air stopped as soon as they shot out. The two mecha on the peak still stood quietly, but then a metal component fell off from the white mecha's mechanical arm and smashed heavily into the weathered rocks on the peak, stirring up a cloud of dust. Another object fell heavily, and the dust rose again. At the same time, the purple sea mecha not far away also began to shed its components. Those components also fell to the ground, shaking up the dust. The dust filled the peak and gradually covered the figures of the two mecha. Then, it gradually calmed down, revealing their true appearance. It was still the two MX mecha, one purple and one white. Around the mechanical legs of the mecha were countless pieces of equipment of various sizes scattered. It was like a reptile shedding its skin, or like a branch full of fruit, unwilling to bear the heavy weight anymore. The branch broke, and the fruit fell. These comparisons were actually not appropriate. These two MX mecha were actually like two humans who had suddenly entered the height of summer from the dead of winter, shedding all of the thick and heavy cotton jackets on their bodies. Mecha number 2, long-range weapon system automatically detached. Auxiliary balancer ejected. Alloy plate caterpillar detached. Hidden repair arm detached. Block 41 hidden door opened, firmware detached. Mecha number 1, weapon system confirmed to have failed and detached. Infrared auxiliary capture system detached. Alloy plate caterpillar detached. As the two MX mecha on the screen began to shed their components, the electronically synthesized voice in the command hall once again sounded. The cold electronically synthesized female voice fell into the ears of the people in the hall, but it stirred up endless shock. However, these shocks were all very well suppressed in the hearts of the people. They silently and nervously watched everything on the screen. Only now did they know that those thin white streams of air that had danced wildly like silver snakes in the vacuum earlier were the connection devices used to separate these components from the mecha body. However, other than the expert engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department and the Federal Academy of Science, many of the other important figures watching the battle did not understand why the two MX mecha on the mountain peak would do such a thing at this time. Mecha number 1, dual engines on full power, joint microengine power synthesis, auxiliary flying wing engine on full power, power breaking the upper limit, entering the 15% range. Mecha number 2, dual engines on full power, joint microengine power synthesis, attention please, officially entering overclocking mode. Attention please, officially entering overclocking mode. The people in the command hall were first silent, and then they immediately began to silently bustle about. The technicians and experts in the 3 areas at the front of the hall began to record data. The people watching the battle did not need to personally deal with this situation, but under the commentary of the technicians at the side, they also fell into a tense silence. On the screen, the red beam of light that represented the mecha's power output had been continuously rising, and had long broken through the line that represented safety. The technicians and experts stared nervously at the part of the system they were responsible for, and no one on the viewing platform was talking. This was because everyone knew the horrors of overclocking mode, and knew that the time to truly test the new MX mecha had arrived. Removing all long-range redundant devices, integrating all the power of the mecha's joint microengine, discarding the heavy firepower system, and forcibly adjusting the position of the electronic jets to provide power beyond the limits of the mecha, this was overclocking mode. This was the absolute state for close combat in the design concept of the new mecha, but it was also the most dangerous state. If this was on a real battlefield, a combat mecha in overclocking mode was basically the same as fighting to survive. This was because at this time, the mecha no longer had a complete life support system and long-range capabilities. In a situation where there was no strong backup, even if the opponent was defeated, the only thing left for this mecha in the end was the possibility of self-destruction. The 2 MX mecha participating in the test on the summit of Kaki Peak had simultaneously detached themselves from those life-saving components and entered an overclocked combat state at almost the same time. This was putting themselves in a death zone where they could not lose, where they could not retreat. This was not the planned arrangement of the battle test, and the risk was extremely high. What reason had prompted those 2 pilots to make such a decision? Could it be because of the hypocritical silence earlier? On the viewing platform, Lin Yuanhu slowly stood up and stared at the mecha images on the giant screen, silent for a long time. Below the viewing platform, the people in the Nutshell Engineering Department were busy tracking Little White Flower's data, ensuring that the overclocking power was within the acceptable range of the engine material. No one noticed that Shang Qiu had already left her workstation. She walked to the bottom of the screen and looked up, clenching her hands tightly as she counted silently in her heart. 175,174, on the summit, Little White Flower's mecha suddenly trembled. It only trembled a little before it stuck close to the weathered rock surface of the platform and swept towards the Purple Sea mecha. If it was said that the high speed of the 2 MX mecha in running mode with the help of the auxiliary flying wings had already shocked everyone in the command hall, then the mecha's movements in overclocking mode right now were so fast that it was almost a blur. The surrounding dust and smoke kicked up by the heavy mecha's footsteps could not keep up with the movements of that white shadow at all. The Purple Sea mecha's speed was faster than Little White Flower's, and its movements were more precise and direct. Its heavy mechanical legs were as nimble as air. The spherical joints opened slightly, and the body of the mecha made a strange twist, causing the alloy-toothed blade in front of the white mecha's mechanical arm to graze the white mecha's right arm. The Purple Sea mecha's right shoulder trembled, and the 3-edged alloy blade at the front of the mechanical arm stabbed viciously into the white mecha's side ribs. There was no strong wind at the summit, but a great cloud of dust and smoke covered the sky. The 2 newest MX mecha were like 2 fearless warriors in the midst of the dust and smoke, neither retreating nor escaping. The anti-skid mechanical legs gripped the ground tightly as they performed extremely difficult attacks and chops. In less than 20 seconds, who knew how many alloy fists had smashed heavily into each other's bodies? The powerful power provided by the twin engines was now completely converted into speed and close-range combat strength under overclocking mode. That was a destructive force. The 80 cm alloy tri-edged blade drew a streak of faint purple light across the summit and stabbed viciously into the white mecha's body. Then it was pulled out, leaving behind several trails of liquid, and the impact knocked over several pieces of armor connected to the mecha's body. In overclocking mode, the Purple Sea mecha was more like a space chariot driven by a god. Its power was unstoppable, its power unmatched. Su Lu did not have the time to wipe away the fresh blood at the corner of his lips. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the data display on his helmet, using all his strength to move the power in his body and control the simulation system to perform mecha movements one after another that even he himself could not imagine, dodging the terrifying attacks of the Purple Sea mecha. At the same time, he counted silently in his heart, 159,158. Chapter 254. The battle at the peak was completely different from the battle at the foot of the mountain, as well as the running between the mountains. Both the Purple Sea mecha and Little White Flower no longer made any movements of flying. Instead, they clung to the ground with their mechanical legs, relying entirely on the movements of the mecha's upper body to fight. The honest here naturally meant that they had slowed down their speed by many times before they could sense it. In reality, the two MX mecha were like willow tree monsters, rooted deeply in the soil, not a trace of disorder in the slightest. Every step they took seemed so solid, but the movements of the upper half of the mecha were like willow branches dancing wildly in the wind, fast, dangerous, and terrifyingly precise. This scene gave the spectators the illusion that the mechanical legs of the two MX mecha in overclocking did not seem to move at all. Instead, it was only the ground beneath the mecha that moved. The godlike Purple Sea mecha twisted its body, and the sharp tri-edged armor-piercing thorn slid along the surface of Little White Flower's already broken alloy mecha. The huge tri-edged thorn, nearly 1 meter long, was like a fireworks stick in the hands of a child. The tip of the thorn brought out a shocking spark. In the midst of the silent battle, the sawtooth blade on the right mechanical arm of the white mech silently sliced across from under the arm, leaving a shallow cut on the wrist of the Purple Sea mech, but at least it stopped the Purple Sea mech from delivering a fatal stab. The loud roar of the twin engines did not have air as a medium to announce its power, but it caused the body of the mecha to tremble. Under the effect of the peak power, the Purple Sea mecha retracted its mechanical leg, and like a gust of wind, it forced its way into the midsection of Little White Flower's mecha, its shoulder slamming into the midsection of the cockpit. For a moment, broken pieces of the shock-absorbing armor flew everywhere. A chilling distortion slowly appeared, and the white mecha slumped, about to fall 147. Su Lu ignored the bloodstains on his chest, silently counting down in his heart. The weight of high speed was already a heavy enough burden for a pilot. After entering overclocking mode, Little White Flower's mecha could no longer provide a complete shock-absorbing and life-support system like before when it faced the violent attack of the Purple Sea head-on. The tremendous impact caused his iron-like body to feel sore and painful, as if it was about to fall apart. Su Lu didn't know how many mouthfuls of blood he had spat out. His face was a little pale as he stared at the holographic screen in his helmet. His hands moved quickly, and the joysticks made cracking sounds as if they were about to break. Every inch of his skin was burning as he sent instructions to the simulation system. Controlling Little White Flower to block Purple Sea's fierce thrust, but it was unable to block Purple Sea's powerful strike. As the surface of the mech changed shape, Su Li's vision turned black for a moment from the tremendous force. From the warning data of the onboard computer, he knew that Little White Flower had lost its balance. With a muffled grunt, Su Li's body, which was wrapped in the simulation system, began to tremble rapidly. Countless complex commands were transmitted to every component of the mecha. The thick and heavy mechanical legs began to tremble and slide. They began to move in a semi-closed arc around a certain fixed point. The high-speed hydraulic pipelines and transmission devices in the armor pressed, stretched, and returned to their original positions at a speed that could not be seen with the naked eye. During this process, the terrifying impact of the Purple Sea's mecha was gradually dispelled. Little White Flower's mecha looked like it was on the brink of death, but in the end, it stood proudly at the end of the two deep trenches. Can't fall. Su Lu flicked the 5 fingers of his right hand. Cooperating with the simulation system, he controlled Little White Flower's mecha to stick close to the platform on the peak and charge towards the Purple Sea once more. After entering overclocking mode, both Sulu and Madmanly no longer used the fierce leaping attack moves they had done at the foot of the mountain. Instead, with great tacit understanding, they had their mecha cling tightly to the weathered rocks on the peak as they advanced. Their horizontal movement speed increased slightly, but neither attempted to attack from the air. Overclocking battle was an extremely risky battle mode. From the very beginning, Sulu had acted on instinct and operated his mecha according to the 10 stances Uncle Feng Yu had taught him. He was not willing to let Little White Flower leave the ground for even a microsecond. Those 10 mysterious and strange stances were all powerful body techniques that allowed one to stand tall on the ground and remain as still as a pine tree. He did not quite understand why the Purple Sea's mecha would also choose this type of battle mode. Could it be that Uncle Feng was really related to the Lees of Philadelphia in some way? Sulu could vaguely grasp the Purple Sea's mecha's battle style and attack patterns. Linking it to that night in Linyuan, he even had a feeling that the 10 stances Uncle Feng had taught him seemed to be some kind of secret technique to counter the Lees of Philadelphia. However, Madmanly was still Madmanly after all. It was no wonder he was known as the invincible fighter in the military. It was no wonder he was the super strong fighter who had continuously hunted down the Empire's Royal Mecha Battalion for more than 3 years. Then, he had begun to operate the M52 on the mineral planets, on the pirate ships. He had learned how to slaughter, and had gotten used to smashing the enemy's mecha into a pile of scrap metal. In the short 16 years of Madman Lee's life, he had always been closely associated with the term mecha, never separating from it. Sometimes, he even felt that every time he stayed in the stuffy and quiet cockpit, he was his true self. Invincible in the military, Madmanly, these were all adjectives he had gotten from operating a mecha. This was because the moment he entered a mecha, he would be even wilder and more violent than usual. This was because he was even stronger in a mecha. Thus, Li Feng could not understand why Sulu had been able to hold on for so long. Why did he not admit defeat even though he knew that defeat was certain and could only be worse? Thinking of that bet, and the white mecha's persistence at this moment, Madman Lee's eyes narrowed even more. A hint of anger flashed through his reddish eyes. The Purple Sea mecha attacked fiercely once again, ravaging the Little White Flower over and over again. There was no such thing as mutual appreciation. The pale-faced Sulu stared with wide eyes amidst the intense tremors. He stared at that Purple Sea which was like a mad tiger, controlling his mecha to avoid those fatal points of attack as he mumbled softly to himself, "Fuck you, fuck you." His voice was so gentle, so calm that even he himself felt that he was still calm. He did not feel the intimidating power and aura displayed by the Purple Sea mecha before him. However, his rationality told him that whether it was in terms of mecha operation accuracy, battle experience, or any of the qualities and abilities required to operate a mecha, Li Feng was far above him in all aspects. If this had not been a secret military test match, Sulu knew that Madmanly would definitely not mind killing him after defeating him. Thus, there was no such thing as mutual appreciation. He only stared coldly, wanting to see how the other would die. The countdown in his heart had already reached 1,117 seconds. 1 minute had passed, so there were still more than 2 minutes left. Sulu did not know if he could hold on for more than 2 minutes. He did not know if the Little White Flower's mecha would explode prematurely. After entering overclocking, the battle was even more one-sided. The white mecha was in an extremely wretched state, looking like it could explode at any moment. However, Sulu had no intention of surrendering. He only made each of his operations more precise, each of his dodges faster, each of his attacks fiercer. On the quiet platform of Cocky Peak, the Purple Sea mech was like an invincible god, while the white mech was like a trembling little white flower. Occasionally, it would be blown away by the wind or crushed by the giant's feet. There were several parts of the mech's body that were bent out of shape. Liquid leaked out, and the central control system was damaged. It could collapse at any moment. But it did not collapse. The people in the ground command hall watched the images on the screen in silence. The neutral military mechanics and engineers watched this scene quietly. A sense of respect for the successor of the military god grew in their hearts, as well as respect for the nutshell mecha operator. On the other hand, the staff in the nutshell area were clenching their fists nervously. Looking at the tragic sight of the little white flower on the screen, all of them had the urge to admit defeat. Shang Qiu's eyes had already turned into the moon's. She stared blankly at the screen. She knew that the little white flower's mecha was not willing to admit defeat. It was persevering, wanting to hold on until that moment arrived. But the problem was, looking at the data being fed back at this moment, the little white flower's mecha would not be able to hold on until that moment. It would be in danger of exploding. As the technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she did not have the authority to stop this test. But subtly, she suddenly really hoped that Su Lu would admit defeat, because this way, at least he would be able to preserve his own life. There was nervousness, there was respect, and naturally there were other emotions as well. Not everyone would cast a respectful gaze towards a persevering loser. The professors and experts from the Federal Academy of Science were already smiling calmly and confidently as they watched the screen at the top of Cocky Peak. From their perspective, the standards of the Federation's new MX mecha would definitely be the glory that belonged to them. On the viewing platform, Dean Lin Yuanhu no longer leaned forward. He stroked the white hair at the corner of his forehead and sat back down in his chair. Turning his head, he whispered a few words to the National Security Advisor beside him. There were not many people in the Old Moon base who had the authority to watch this mecha test battle, but there were still more than 100 people. They were all soldiers of the Federation, so naturally, they would stand on the side of the heir of the military god who was operating the Purple Sea mecha. Just like the people from the Academy of Science in the ground command hall, they too had relaxed smiles on their faces. It was just that the people in the military base were more direct in their reactions. Some of them began to cheer, while others even began to count. These military officers thought back to the bet that the technical supervisor of Nutshell had made with Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng 2 days ago. They thought back to the young man's disrespect towards the military god of Philadelphia. Right now, watching the Purple Sea mecha tormenting the little white flower in a frenzy, their emotions were stirred to the extreme. 1, 2, 3. They were counting. How many more seconds would it take for the Purple Sea mecha to defeat that white mecha? They were even wondering if they should immediately go and drag the technical supervisor of Nutshell out so that he could fulfill his end of the bet and kneel down before the Lees of Philadelphia. Chapter 255. Looks like your Shell Motor Company is indeed not popular. The MX mecha will be allocated to soldiers in the future, but look at the attitude of the military. They are clearly only willing to accept the Purple Sea. What are you all fighting for? In a room on the second floor of the Old Moon Base's observation hall, the official from the Constitutional Bureau rubbed his throbbing abdomen as he looked at Bai Yulan, who had her head lowered in silence, and sneered. He didn't know that those soldiers were so fanatically supporting the Federal Academy of Science's Purple Sea mecha because of the Lees of Philadelphia. The soldiers in the base had followed the request of the Bureau of Proclamation. After arresting Bai Yulan, they had actually kept him locked up in the base. This matter involved the Federation's MX mecha test. No matter how detached the Bureau of Proclamation was from the political structure of the Federation, they couldn't immediately do anything to Bai Yulan. Besides, there were still many things hidden behind this matter. Since that official had already fulfilled the request of some power and kept the pilot that Nutshell had originally arranged to stay, he naturally didn't want to cause any more trouble. Bai Yulan slowly raised his head and quietly looked through the glass door of the room at the breathtaking MX mecha battle on the screen. He was silent for a long time. He thought to himself that if he was the one controlling Little White Flower now, he might have been able to complete it better than Su Lu in the beginning. However, right now, under the violent attacks of the Purple Sea, he definitely wouldn't be willing to hold on like this. 8. 9. What are you saying? The official from the Bureau of Proclamation looked at him coldly. Bai Yulan turned his head and said softly, "I'm counting. How long will it take for the Purple Sea mecha from the Academy of Science to explode?" He paused for a moment, then continued softly, "Now it seems that I really have to thank you for locking me up. Otherwise, how could that guy be angry enough to personally go into battle?" The face of the official from the Bureau of Proclamation darkened slightly. He didn't say anything else. He turned his head to look at the MX battle that he was also very interested in. He thought to himself that this delicate man was probably mad to the point of insanity. Otherwise, why would he say such a thing? Some people participated in the Federation's extreme long-distance race, but in the end, their legs were crippled and their bodies were exhausted. However, they still stubbornly shook off the hands of the medical staff and limped towards the finish line, ignoring whether there were still spectators around them. Su Lu respected these men with sportsmanship, but he would not do that. He didn't want to cause trouble, wasn't afraid of trouble, and didn't want to attract attention. But if he was running on the track and people in the same race tried to trip him or use tricks, then he would keep running until he overtook them and won the championship. Then he would turn around coldly, look at those people, ask why, reason with them, and fight for his dignity. This guy was not afraid when someone pointed a cold gun at his head in the Donglin district. He was only angry. When he encountered an iron fist, he did not cower. Instead, he bravely escaped. He did not leave timidly. Instead, he went to find Feng Yu. This guy was not afraid when he saw the black mecha in the underground parking lot. Instead, he kicked it fiercely. When he was bullied by important people, he did not back down. Instead, he stood up bravely. He did not use the data to try to get anything. Instead, he stood there silently, waiting for reason and fairness. He stood there until now. The little white flower's mecha was in a sorry state. It was miserable. It could explode at any time, but he refused to admit defeat. Perhaps even he himself did not understand when this stubbornness, which seemed to have faded from his life as a young miner, had returned to his body. He did not think of Uncle Feng Yu. He did not think of the innocent waitresses who died in the Linhai State Stadium. He did not think of Zhang Xiaomeng who died in a political conspiracy. He did not think of Shi Qinghai who was betrayed and disappeared. He did not think of Professor Shen in the Galaxy Public Cemetery. He did not think of the old professor's hard work in the experiment data. He did not think of the officer surnamed Park on Hushan Road. He did not think of the broken bodies at the concert in Huanshan Mountain. He did not think of the independent director in the rainy night. He did not think of Magnolia who was arrested by the Bureau of Proclamation 2 days ago. Because there was no need to think of these. They were all buried deep in his mind. From Donglin to S1, the unfairness, darkness, and conspiracy of the Federation had always been there. Su Lu often thought of the letter Shi Qinghai left for him before he left. In the face of social injustice, some people wanted to be the ones to inflict it. Some people silently accepted it. Some people wanted to change something. Those without power would shout on the internet, using silence to express their anger. And what should those with power do? MX Mecha, the Academy of Science, Politics, the election, Su Lu had already unconsciously become a person with power. He could change some things, so he told himself that he must persevere. Each time the little white flower suffered a heavy blow, it was like a sledgehammer striking a rock. This rock persevered, but who knew whether the rock would shatter in the end? Or the sledgehammer would shatter? Or would the people in the Federation who wielded the sledgehammer be afraid and tired? Su Lu stared with red eyes at the crazed silhouette of the purple sea mecha in his field of vision, but he was unusually calm as he carried out his own operations. The little white flower mecha could not hold on for much longer, but he was becoming more and more familiar with the controls, feeling stronger and stronger. Those 10 poses that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him back then were all perfectly executed by him using the little white flower mecha. His eyes were red. Naturally, it was not because he was moved or sad, but because there was fire, a very big fire. Su Lu stared at that terrifying purple sea mecha, thinking of that arrogant and unreasonable person inside the mecha. When we first met at Linyuan, you wanted to kill me. When we met at the hospital, you said you wanted to kill me again. Today, when we met again at the peak of Old Moon Peak, you still wanted to kill me. Although you have never really killed me, what right do you have to say this so calmly? You are the only grandson of the Federation's military god. You are a rare genius pilot. You joined the army at the age of 12 to kill the enemy, and you have already become a legend. So you want to proudly say that one day you will kill me? I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I have already killed when I was 10. Today, I want to beat you up, and then make you call me uncle. 98, 97. 63, 61. 38, 37, Su Le and Shang Qiu had repeatedly calculated many times. The electronic jets that the Purple Sea mecha had designed based on that deviated functional model could only last for 3 minutes because the dual-engine mecha needed to adjust its posture while in overclocking mode. In the past, in his mind, 3 minutes was a very short amount of time. But today, he found that these 180 seconds were actually as long as space travel and unbearable. There were still 37 seconds left, but the little white flower mecha was already at its most dangerous edge. Su Le silently operated his mecha to make an attack motion, but he knew that even if he did not accept it, he was going to lose today. However, right at this moment, the Purple Sea mecha, which had been as crazy as a drunken tiger, with an overwhelming presence, and had the absolute advantage all this while, suddenly seemed somewhat uncoordinated as it executed a standard left-spinning sideways attack motion. In the next instant, the Purple Sea mecha's beautiful back armor vibrated. On the giant holographic screen in the ground command hall, many of the technical parameters belonging to Mecha Number 1 were performing perfectly. Even in overclocking mode, they were still very stable. In contrast, on the other side, Mecha Number 2's technical parameters were already somewhat horrible to look at. No one knew how that nutshell pilot could still operate a mecha that was about to be scrapped. However, right at this moment, the light beam representing the most important power output indicator of Mecha Number 1 abruptly stopped moving up and down within the normal range, coming to a standstill at a certain level. Then, the power output light beam fell abruptly, rushing towards its original position. The red light beam fell abruptly. It looked like blood loss. It was a ghastly sight. No one in the entire command hall could react. Even Nutshell and the other engineers could only stare blankly at the holographic screen, thinking that their eyes were playing tricks on them. However, Shang Qiu, who had been nervous for a long time, reacted faster than anyone else. She raised her right hand high into the air and clenched it into a fist. In her fist was a pen. She shouted excitedly, "Fuck!" The profanity of this genius female engineer woke up many people in the command hall. As if someone was commanding them, the engineers, experts, and professors of the three factions all let out cries of surprise at the same time. Combined together, it was like a giant wave, flooding the entire command hall. In the stands, Lin Yuanhu, who had been quietly chatting with the National Security Advisor, had not looked at the monotonous and one-sided battle on the holographic screen in order to show his confidence to the people of the Federation. He indeed had absolute confidence in both Purple Sea and Mad Manly, especially after overclocking mode. So, when he heard the cries of surprise, he could not help but be a little surprised. Dean Lin Yuanhu turned his head and saw that the power output indicator on the holographic screen had already fallen to 0. He stood up abruptly, his aged lips becoming incomparably pale. His body swayed twice. He clutched his left chest, as if he could collapse at any moment. The soldiers in the Old Moon base had already counted to 70. They thought that Purple Sea's mecha was already in the bag and that perhaps the nutshell white mecha would explode in the next moment. Bai Yulan had already stood up and was standing behind the door. She looked at the holographic screen with slight anxiety. She had already counted to 37 seconds, but it seemed that she could no longer see the possibility of what would happen next. Right at this moment, the sound of the Old Moon base counting suddenly stopped abruptly. Everyone looked at the holographic screen in confusion. They did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's originally incomparably sharp left-turn footwork had become somewhat sluggish. Moreover, the sluggishness was a little too much. "It's probably the image being delayed," some people thought in their hearts. Maybe he wants to leave the nutshell mecha to play with for a while longer. Some people thought of Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng's movements. What happened next made the speculations of all the old Moon Base officers become a joke. On the platform at the peak of Mount Kaki, the Purple Sea mecha had not even finished its sluggish left-turn footwork when the struggling white mecha suddenly moved violently. This naturally could not be the result of the image being delayed. In the moment when the Purple Sea mecha was on the brink of dissatisfaction and struggle, every abnormality in its movements was like a provocative signal that entered Su Li's brain through his eyes. However, in the previous long period of time, Madman Li had controlled the Purple Sea mecha with a sense of indifference in its madness. There had been no loopholes that could be exploited. However, at this moment, the beautiful left-turn footwork of the Purple Sea mecha had a problem. For Su Lu, who had been waiting bitterly for more than 100 seconds, this anomaly undoubtedly represented his best chance. Although he did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's problem had occurred 37 seconds earlier than he had predicted, he knew that he had to grab hold of this opportunity. In reality, Su Lu needed to exert any kind of mental pressure on himself to make the final explosive strike. This was because, like a spring that had been suppressed for a long time, if it did not lose its elasticity due to metal fatigue and adhesion, once it got the chance, it would definitely rebound strongly. Or, like a drowning person, once they grabbed hold of something by their side, they would definitely not let go. Through this series of brutal blows, Su Lu had gradually come to understand how to use the simulation system to replicate the 10 poses that the uncle had taught him with his mecha. However, Little White Flower's mecha was severely damaged, and Crazy Li was putting too much pressure on him. His attacks were too ferocious, so there was no chance for him to put it into practice. At this time, the Purple Sea mecha suddenly changed. The heavy pressure on Mount Kaki loosened, and Little White Flower's mecha, which had been teetering on the brink of collapse, suddenly displayed absolute speed. It turned into a flowing shadow, evading the triangular alloy spike on the right mechanical arm of the Purple Sea mecha. The white mecha's thick mechanical legs seemed to be trembling, but in reality, it was moving quickly, sticking close to the ground. In an instant, it twisted its body to stand face to face with the Purple Sea mecha. The serrated blade at the front of the mechanical arm chopped down viciously at the neck of the Purple Sea mecha, sending sparks flying. Immediately after that, Little White Flower's mecha swaggered up, charging straight for the middle of the Purple Sea mecha's abdomen. At the same time, its left mechanical arm wrapped around the Purple Sea mecha's head, and the battered Little White Flower lowered its head, slamming viciously into the assembled armor beside the Purple Sea mecha's cockpit. Sparks flew everywhere, smoke and dust flew everywhere. The white light was blinding, and the mecha warped and twisted. There was mist and blood-like liquid leaking out. Little White Flower's mecha and the Purple Sea mecha continued to maintain this stance. In today's MX battle, Madman Li's Purple Sea mecha had been extremely domineering. However, Su Li's Little White Flower mecha had been able to push its performance to the limits despite being at an extreme disadvantage. The situation had looked tragic, but it had successfully evaded most of the fatal attacks, which was why Little White Flower had been able to hold on until the very last moment. However, at this time, Little White Flower's sudden burst of 3 consecutive attacks had truly hit the Purple Sea's vital points. Whether it was the connecting part of the mecha's skull or the assembled armor beside the cockpit, after suffering such heavy damage, how could it still stand? Chapter 256. Little White Flower's final 3 consecutive attacks looked simple, but in reality, it was the most perfect attack that Su Lu could execute while operating the damaged mecha. Each of Little White Flower's seemingly normal attacks were in fact continuous, avoiding Purple Sea's attacks after losing power and still relying on inertia to maintain high speed, successfully dealing heavy damage to the opponent. This was a combination of 3 of the 10 stances that Feng Yu had taught Su Lu, and it was executed by Little White Flower's mecha in an instant. The high-speed chain blade at the front of the mechanical arm was pulled out of Purple Sea's mecha, leaving behind a trail of sparks as it drew a tragic wound. This action was very fast, but it looked exceptionally slow. Having lost power, Purple Sea's mecha seemed to have no power left to fight back, but Little White Flower did not stop there. The mecha moved at high speed, and within a second, it turned into countless white lines on the peak of Cocky Peak, continuously attacking Purple Sea. The tips of those white lines were dyed black, appearing dark and sinister. The countless lines converged on the body of Purple Sea's mecha, finally converging into a single point, and violently releasing a burst of power. This scene fell into the eyes of the people watching the battle in the command hall of the Old Moon base. They all felt their scalps go numb. This was a military test battle, and the nutshell operator controlling Little White Flower's mecha actually did not stop, as if he was hell-bent on destroying the opponent's mecha. This method was a little too ruthless. The peak of Cocky Peak trembled. The vacuum space that had been silent for hundreds of millions of years seemed to be about to be distorted by Little White Flower's final ruthless attacks. Little White Flower's mecha was like a cold-blooded monster, continuously executing high-speed attack moves. That was because Sulu, who was operating the mecha, knew very well what kind of monster Madman Li was in Purple Sea. Moreover, Purple Sea's twin engines had exploded more than 10 seconds earlier than expected. What was the reason for this? He needed to coldly and completely defeat Purple Sea, not giving the opponent any chance to escape. This was only the calculations of the silent engineer, but on the screen, Little White Flower appeared very ferocious at this moment. Following the final inertia of the Purple Sea mecha, the sharp and hard alloy stiletto about 1 meter long stabbed viciously into the left mechanical leg of the Little White Flower mecha, with the last bit of power remaining in the microengine channels of the various joints. The heavily injured Little White Flower's left mechanical arm snapped like a spring that had been suppressed for too long. Finally, it could no longer withstand anything. This was Purple Sea's final attack that Sulu had always been wary of. Little White Flower's mecha's high-speed fanged blade stabbed over viciously. Just like the disciples of the pugilistic world who had thrown themselves into the shadows of the city's forest, without thinking twice, the blade broke through the armor and stabbed deeply in. Then, there was true silence. Little White Flower's mecha's left mechanical leg splashed with sparks. Liquid sprayed onto the white mountaintop rocks, unable to support the heavy body of the mecha anymore. It looked like a crippled warrior, only able to rely on the front end of the mechanical arm for support. 2 meters in front of him, Purple Sea's mecha suddenly shuddered, and then fell to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. In the last moment, the powerful Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had still managed to remove one of Little White Flower's left mechanical legs, but Little White Flower had damaged Purple Sea's entire system. Right now, Purple Sea's dual-core engines had already exploded, and the power of the joint microengines had dissipated. It was already a dead object. Watching the other build a mecha that was as tall as a building, watching this mecha collapse, right under the smoke and dust of Cocky Peak. In the stuffy cockpit, Sulu slowly pushed off his helmet. He breathed heavily and hurriedly, wiping away the blood at the corner of his mouth. Looking at Purple Sea's mecha that was like a pile of scrap metal not too far away, he knew that the opponent no longer had any combat power. Only then did he truly relax and not continue to pursue. A faint trace of excitement and frustration welled up in his heart, but Sulu did not feel the slightest bit of pride. He narrowed his eyes and stared blankly at Purple Sea's mecha on the ground, endless exhaustion welling up in his heart. Madman Li had not been defeated by him. It was just that Purple Sea had been defeated by Little White Flower. As a pilot, he did not have any sense of accomplishment with which to boast about himself. The onboard computer of Little White Flower's mecha began to sound an alarm. The assembly system was already on the verge of collapse. The gravity of the Old Moon was much smaller than that of the S1 mecha, but the previously incomparably powerful and seemingly invincible Purple Sea's mecha collapsed with a crash into the weathered rocks, shaking up a cloud of dust on the ground. It appeared exceptionally heavy. Everyone who saw this scene felt as if their hearts had been ruthlessly smashed by a heavy stone. Purple Sea's mecha collapsed on the mountaintop. In the cockpit, Li Feng slowly pushed off his helmet and then lay motionless on his back. Through the visual system, he looked at the starry sky above his head. For a very long time, he did not speak or move. He only remained silent. Purple Sea's mecha had been continuously damaged in the end. Its engine had exploded, and it was already a pile of trash. The last life support system was also beginning to gradually lose its function. Danger was approaching, but Madman Li did not seem to care at all. In the previous battle, Purple Sea had always held the advantage in terms of attack. His body had not suffered any injuries. A strange expression flashed across that delicate face. His thin lips moved slightly, and he muttered to himself, "Fuck." The sound of counting in the old moon base came to an abrupt halt the moment Purple Sea's mecha had a problem. The scene that had happened in reality made those Federation soldiers who were proud of Philadelphia's military god feel incredulous. The people in the hall stared at the holographic screen. Seeing Little White Flower's last series of vicious attacks, their expressions were abnormally shocked. When the last purple mecha suddenly and decisively fell to the ground, while Little White Flower's mecha was still dragging a broken mechanical leg and barely standing up, the old moon base became even quieter, a deathly silence. Then, almost at the same time, there was a burst of exclamations and curses. "Fuck!" In the room upstairs, Magnolia shook her head. She glanced at the extremely ugly expression of the Bureau of Proclamation official beside her. The fist in her pocket clenched tightly, and she let out a muffled breath. The ground command hall was even more lively. No one could accept this result in a short time, including the expert engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department. Purple Sea's mecha from the Academy of Science was clearly about to obtain a decisive victory, but in the end, it had exploded. In the previous parameter curves, there were no signs of danger at all. What was going on? Fuck! Although the technicians from the Nutshell Engineering Department couldn't understand, seeing their company's Little White Flower obtain the final victory, they were already jumping up and down in excitement. They clapped and cheered with each other, using vulgarities to vent their excitement and nervousness. Shang Qiu was one of the few people who could foresee today's situation. When the Purple Sea's power output had abruptly decreased, she had already involuntarily cursed. Now, however, she was able to stabilize her emotions. A happy smile appeared on her clean face. Although she knew from the very beginning that the Purple Sea mecha was the biggest hidden danger, Madman Li's suppressive fighting style had successfully dealt a heavy blow to Little White Flower. She had been worried for so long, and now she could finally relax. Subconsciously, Shang Qiu turned around to look. She wanted to see the expressions of the professors from the Academy of Science and Director Lin Yuanhu. Although the mechanics and engineers of the Federal Military General Assembly Base were also abnormally surprised that the successor of the war god would lose this battle, they still woke up a little faster than the two parties involved. They had already begun the follow-up procedures. They were just thinking in their hearts. The excellent performance of the Purple Sea mecha had actually been destroyed in the last second. What was the reason? The professors and experts of the Federal Academy of Science were looking at the screen with desolate expressions. They looked at the two mecha that had already entered the recycling procedures. They had put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for that purple MX. Now, they could only watch helplessly as it was defeated. No one could understand why the engine had malfunctioned. That kind of feeling of defeat mixed with the confusion of the unknown made their expressions incomparably gloomy. Shang Qiu looked at these images, and a sweet and satisfied smile bloomed on her lips. However, she immediately noticed that Director Lin Yuanhu, who had originally been stunned, had now calmly returned to his seat. Her heart couldn't help but skip a beat. The important figures of the Federation government and military in the stands were all shocked by the sudden turn of events at the peak of Kaki Mountain. They all stood up, hands on the railings in front of them, and looked at the screen in shock. Occasionally, they would lower their heads and whisper something to the people around them. Just as they were about to sit down, the sound of footsteps came from the entrance of the command hall. The president of the Federation, Mr. Sieg, had finally finished an important meeting and hurried over. However, the battle was already over. Everyone stood up and saluted the president. Shang Qiu, however, noticed Supervisor Jose who had walked in with the president. She narrowed her eyes. She couldn't help but feel that there was some hidden meaning in Supervisor Jose's gaze. The battle at the peak of Cocky Mountain had already ended. The Federation's near-space fleet was currently completing the recovery procedures. The images on the giant holographic screen had already been replaced by a continuous flow of various technical data comparisons. The soldiers at the old moon base who had watched the battle had already left, cursing and swearing. The two pilots who had personally participated in the battle were currently receiving treatment. Meanwhile, there was still a lot of work to be done in the ground command hall. These tasks were even more important than the battle itself. While the preparation procedures for the data calibration were being carried out, the command hall was temporarily much quieter. Many people began to rest, drinking coffee, and trying to soothe their previously tense emotions. In a small conference room at the side of the command hall, President Sieg sat in the middle seat. He lowered his head and looked at the battle report presented by his subordinates. He hadn't made a final decision regarding the battle test and the Federation's new mecha standards. Using the battle method, which was too direct, so much so that it was almost like child's play, to determine the Federation's new MX mecha standards was a suggestion made by that old man in Philadelphia. That old man could basically influence the attitude of the entire federal military. Therefore, logically speaking, the results of the battle at the peak of Cocky Mountain should be able to determine who the standards belonged to. However, it was clear that some people weren't willing to admit their failure. All the technical parameters show that the Purple Sea mecha developed by the Federal Academy of Science has an incomparable advantage in the aspect of nutshell. The National Security Advisor frowned. He knew that it wasn't a good choice for him to speak up first. However, the development of the situation was completely out of his expectations. For the sake of his future political future, he could only go against the president's hint and continue to stand on the side of the Academy of Science. The president's science advisor looked at him in disbelief. He didn't understand that the truth was right in front of him. The Purple Sea mecha had only entered overclocking mode for 2 minutes before exploding. How could the Federation use such a standard? Why was the National Security Advisor so insistent? The truth is very clear, the science advisor said, somewhat annoyed. In the end, it was the Purple Sea mecha that exploded. What else is there to say? The Federation's new mecha standards should, of course, use the nutshell standards. The National Security Advisor shook his head and said, a new standard is not a small matter. How can it be decided with just one battle? It should be considered comprehensively. The Purple Sea's high performance is obviously more useful to the federal military. You're being unreasonable. The science advisor couldn't be bothered to argue with this person about stability. He said directly, then what's the point of arranging this battle today? President Sieg suddenly raised his head and glanced at Lin Yuanhu. He said calmly, Director, do you have any opinion? Lin Yuanhu's hands, which were covered in age spots, rested calmly on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, under normal battle conditions, the Purple Sea has the absolute advantage. Overclocking mode is unstable to begin with, and this is just a test model. Even if the problem with the Purple Sea mecha today was not a coincidence, it can always be improved. President Sieg's expression did not change, but his mood became somewhat irritated. He glanced coldly at Lin Yuanhu. If this old director of the Academy of Science had not said anything, perhaps his opinion of this person would have improved. Lin Yuanhu seemed to not sense the president's gaze. He lowered his eyes and said slowly in an old voice, overclocking is a rare situation. The federal military is equipped with standard mecha. I don't think it's appropriate to use such a rare situation as a standard background comparison. This reason seemed to make a lot of sense. If it was a normal battle with 2 engines and 4 times the power output, the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha would indeed be extremely outstanding. However, at this moment, another voice rang out in the conference room. General Miles said slowly, I don't agree with Dean Lin's opinion. It will be very common for the new mecha to enter overclocking mode in the future. The Federation's Minister of Defense was hospitalized due to illness. Meanwhile, Zhou Yingxing, who was in charge of the department's work, could not directly participate in the discussion at the highest level due to the collective actions of certain powers. At this moment, in the small conference room, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, was undoubtedly the absolute representative of the military. Chapter 257. In the battle for the standards of the MX Mecha, General Miles, as one of the most important figures in the military, had once leaned towards the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea Mecha. On one hand, he had been influenced by certain people, and on the other hand, he respected Director Lin Yuanhu. Having been in the military for decades, he knew better than anyone how much the Federal Academy of Science had contributed to the Federal Army. In fact, it was not just him. That 3-star female General Hong Yuliang, who was cruising in space, had leaned towards the standards of the Academy of Science in the beginning for this reason. However, the Federal Army was loyal to the Federation and the representative of the Federation, Mr. President. The excellent traditions of the past many years allowed this iron-like army to not lose its way amidst the prosperity of interstellar space. These military bigwigs, when faced with a major issue that involved the combat power of the Federal Army, would immediately abandon their former personal standpoints and completely stand from the perspective of the Federation to consider the problem. The results of today's battle were already out. The words of Director Lin Yuanhu earlier had made President Sieg very dissatisfied, and a trace of displeasure had also surged in General Miles's heart. How difficult was it for the federal military to cultivate an excellent pilot? Did they have to let the military pilot that Purple Sea which could explode at any time? Even Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had lost to an engine explosion, let alone other pilots. Therefore, when Director Lin Yuanhu felt that the new MX mecha's overclocked state was rare and could not be used to compare the strengths of the two mecha, he had to stand up and say something. As the number one figure in the military in the present conference room, his words carried a lot of weight. And to a certain extent, he also represented the military's opinion on this battle. Mr. President has been personally paying attention to the development of the new MX mecha. General Miles looked around coldly and explained, the reason for this is actually very clear to everyone in the conference room right now. That is because of the information received from the Empire. The Empire's development of the new mecha has already begun, and they have made a breakthrough. As for what level of breakthrough, we have no way of knowing. Everyone has seen today's battle. Under the support of the new MX mecha's super maneuverability, the mecha's self-contained long-range firepower system has been greatly reduced. As long as the enemy is unable to concentrate their firepower in a short period of time. An MX mech is a great gun that can penetrate the enemy's formation and engage in difficult battles. Whether it is the Federation or the Empire, if they want to prevent the enemy's new mecha from launching a surprise attack in a complicated environment and a low-intensity electronic surveillance battlefield, there is only one way to do so. General Miles solemnly extended a finger and said in a heavy tone, use a new mecha against a new mecha, and it's close combat. I'm not used to underestimating the Federation's enemies. We can assume that the Empire's new mecha are similar to the Federation's MX in terms of performance, and that they were developed at about the same time. In that case, the new mecha's close combat capabilities will be an important factor in influencing the situation on the battlefield. General Miles frowned and stopped the National Security Advisor from interrupting. He continued, we all know that overclocking combat is not a stable special state. In a normal battle, no pilot would be willing to enter this state. However, the problem is that the battle of the new mecha is close combat. If you want to kill the enemy and not be killed by the enemy, you can only enter the overclocking combat state. Overclocking is very dangerous. Those barbaric bastards in the Imperial Royal Mecha camp only have melodramatic thoughts of dying for a just cause. Would they be afraid of this kind of danger? Of course they wouldn't be afraid. Then what about us? Even if the pilots of the Federal Army are afraid, they can only not be afraid. Because if they are afraid, they will die. That's why I said that in future planetary surface battles, the new mecha's overclocking combat will be the norm. General Miles glanced at Director Lin Yuanhu and said slowly, the stability of the mecha in the overclocking state is the most urgent requirement of the federal military. Performance is very important, but stability is even more important. The military has always followed this standard when purchasing. We will never let our own young people take this kind of risk. General Miles's speech was very brief, but the people in the conference room were all experienced people. They naturally understood what he meant. The battle between the Federation and the Empire would be a battle of the new mecha against the new mecha. Under this kind of situation, if the Federation pilots were to operate a mecha that would explode in less than 3 minutes after entering the overclocking state, how would they have any chance of winning? Lin Yuanhu's calm face looked even older. The emotions that he had forcefully suppressed earlier, because of the federal military's stance, began to wreak havoc in his withered body again. He subconsciously pressed lightly on the left side of his chest. After a long silence, he said, "The stability problem is not unsolvable. The problem can only be solved when the problem is discovered. With the excellent performance of the Purple Sea, if this problem can be solved, it will also give the outstanding young people of the Federation a greater advantage on the battlefield in the future." Listen to the technical report first. President Sieg rudely interrupted Lin Yuanhu's explanation. He did not give any face to this Federation academic leader and walked out of the conference room directly. Outside the conference room, the deputy director of the Office of the President's Residence, Breen, had been waiting. She took the document from the president's hand and glanced at it from the corner of her eyes. Then, she saw President Sieg nod inconspicuously. Breen trailed behind the crowd. She took out her encrypted phone and dialed a number. After a moment, she said softly, "Madam, Nutshell's performance is very good." None of the important people of the Federation who were walking toward the command hall noticed Breen's call. The National Security Advisor, who had walked a step behind President Sieg, saw the president's gloomy expression and hurried footsteps. He knew that what he had said in the conference room earlier was very inappropriate. Although President Sieg's term as president was about to end, the National Security Advisor did not want his personal relationship with him to be affected. He decided to explain something. Today, the one representing the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea Mecha is Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. He is the grandson of that old man in Philadelphia. The National Security Advisor lowered his voice and said, "I considered this point, which is why I felt that if we use Nutshell as the standard, it might be a bit inappropriate." "What kind of person do you think Marshal Li is?" President Sieg abruptly turned around and reprimanded Li Yundong without any trace of politeness. His voice was not loud, but his tone was very heavy. "The criteria for deciding the battle is the Marshal's suggestion. Don't treat Marshal Li as an ordinary person." The National Security Advisor frowned slightly and said softly, "But it is not easy for the Federation to establish a heroic figure." There was a lot of unsaid meaning in this sentence. President Sieg's expression was dark. He thought to himself that this teacher was really getting worse and worse. He was actually using that insensible Marshal of Philadelphia to pressure the current president. He said slowly, "You don't need to worry about this matter. I have already issued an order earlier. The details of this mecha battle will be kept completely secret. The Bureau of Proclamation will list it as a fifth-order incident. The auxiliary flying wing effect in a vacuum environment cannot be fully displayed, but when Kajishin's mecha is climbing, the auxiliary flying wing's jet engine is very efficient in adjusting the mecha's posture." On the platform in the command hall, the large holographic screen was replaying the previous battle. Complex data and functional diagrams flashed past the screen as evidence for arguments. The Chief Technical Director of the Ministry of National Defense held a cursor in his hand and marked the contents of the holographic screen. His voice was transmitted through a microphone, echoing clearly in the center of the hall. The technicians of both sides were seriously checking the accuracy of the data. The technicians of the military were providing content for the director on the platform. The important figures of the Federation on the platform listened silently and seriously. The hall was silent. "Everyone, please pay attention to the CLK value and CLS value." The technical director used a cursor to point at the two curves on the holographic screen. Suppressing the excitement in his heart, he said as calmly as he could, the power output indicators of the two test mecha have already greatly surpassed the limits of current technology. The quadruple power output of the twin engines has been fully demonstrated. The new ADS adaptive suspension system has also performed very well in this test. According to the data just obtained, the adaptive suspension systems of the 2MX mecha should be able to last for another 200 minutes or more during the passive wear and tear period. The technical director of the base coughed lightly and looked seriously at the important figures on the platform. He knew that most of them, including President Sieg, would not be able to understand these technical jargon. He paused for a moment, and then said with a smile, "Although the cause of the engine failure of Mecha number 1 under overclocking has not yet been found, we can basically say that the Federation's revolutionary dual-engine mecha has been a success." It was a very normal sentence, but the command hall was filled with enthusiastic applause. The competition for the new MX mecha standard was just a game of chess between the internal forces of the Federation. However, today's results showed that no matter who won or lost, in this vast galaxy, the Federation as a whole had already run ahead of the Empire. As a citizen of the Federation, everyone would feel proud of this. The experts and professors of the Federal Academy of Science were also applauding, but their expressions were not as relaxed and excited as those of the Nutshell Engineering Department. The technical director of the base spent another 10 minutes to report all the data from today's battle test. Then, the Academy of Science in charge of Mecha number 1 chose a representative to come up on stage and give a final summary. This was a professor who looked to be in his 40s or 50s. The professor's expression was rather awkward, but he still very seriously repeated some of the important data, and then said seriously, "Regarding that last malfunction of the Purple Sea mecha, we believe that it was an accident during overclocking. In this test, the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha has already been fully demonstrated. We cannot use a single accident to deny the excellence of the Purple Sea mecha. This is not in line with the spirit of science." As these words left his mouth, the experts and professors of the Academy of Science all nodded. The federal military mechanics and engineers maintained their silence. Some of them recalled the terrifying performance of the Purple Sea mecha earlier and felt that these words made sense. If the Federation gave up just like this, it would be too much of a pity. However, the technicians of the Nutshell Engineering Department were not having it. They did not care at all how many high-ranking officials and generals were on stage. They even completely forgot about the existence of the president. They whistled and began to make a ruckus. The Academy of Science professor on stage, however, calmed down at this time. He pretended that he did not hear the heckling of the Nutshell Engineering Department and said with great sincerity, "If that failure can be resolved and the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha is preserved, I believe that this is the best ending." That professor said a few more things, but Shang Cho did not listen at all. She only lowered her head to process the data sent over by her subordinates, weighing in her mind what she was going to say on stage later. She thought about Sulu, who was still above the old moon, and thought silently in her heart that this matter was not over yet. She was going to represent Sulu and certain people to give Director Lin Yuanhu, as well as everyone in this hall, a big surprise. "Don't care what they say." Supervisor Jose hurried over at this time and put his phone into his pocket. He smiled at Shang Cho's side and said, "The matter has been settled. The president has already decided to use our standards. I am not surprised by this. The Academy of Sciences electronic jet design has a problem. The stability of the dual engines under overclocking is something they have no way of solving at all." Shang Cho raised her head and used her fingertips to push up the frame of her glasses on the bridge of her nose as she said this with a smile. Her smile gradually faded, because she found that Supervisor Jose's expression was rather serious. At this time, the command hall was in a state of chaos. That Academy of Science professor was still trying hard to salvage something, but the audience was in an uproar. No one had noticed the conversation between her and Jose. "Did you and Sula know about this result beforehand?" Mr. Jose was not looking at her, but rather at Professor Chen Shu of the Academy of Science on stage. That professor was saying at this time that the Purple Sea's final failure should have been caused by overheating of the engine system after overclocking for too long. As long as the corresponding design changes were made, this problem could be solved. Hearing this, Shang Qiu was slightly taken aback. She did not understand why Supervisor Jose would say this at this time. Even if the company had guessed what she was going to do when she went on stage later, wasn't this something that should be done? I've already asked Mr. CEO. Supervisor Jose lowered his head and said softly, since we've already won, let's not cause any more trouble. After all, we are all part of the Federation. Forcing the leader of the Federation's academic community into a corner and humiliating an old man is not something to be happy about. Shang Qiu was silent for a long time, analyzing the meaning of Supervisor Jose's words in her heart. A moment later, she raised her head and looked at him with a very complicated gaze. She said, I don't know what kind of deal these big shots of the Federation made in those few minutes just now, but Mr. Jose, you should know very well that I'm just a simple-minded technician. I promised Su Lu, so I will definitely do it. Jose did not think that she would actually dare to reject his arrangements in front of his face. His brows furrowed extremely tightly, and he lowered his voice and quickly reprimanded, the President, the Parliament, the Board of Directors, the entire Federation, no one is willing to hear what you want to say later. He spoke sincerely and sternly. Seeing Shang Qiu lower her head and not say anything, he knew that she should have tacitly agreed to his arrangements. Only then did he let out a breath of relief. He sighed softly and said, Dean Lin will hand in his resignation tomorrow. After all, his position in the hearts of the people is very high. If a scandal were to erupt at this time, the government's credibility in the hearts of the Federation's citizens will probably drop to a terrifying level. At this time when the Empire is about to make a move, the Federation needs the citizens' absolute trust in the government. Chapter 258. Seeing the technical representative of Nutshell take the stage, the command hall immediately became much quieter than before. Then, another round of applause rang out. This time, the applause was softer, but it lasted longer. The technicians of Nutshell looked excitedly at the young technical director on the stage. They knew better than anyone what kind of decisive role this genius female PhD had played in the development of the MX mecha. Even the military generals on the viewing platform began to applaud, expressing their admiration for the technical prowess of the younger generation of the Federation. After the applause died down, Shang Qiu still did not speak. She flipped through the data gently, as if she had encountered an extremely difficult problem. After a long time, she took a deep breath and said slowly, just now, Professor Cui from the Academy of Science said that the two mecha almost broke down at the same time in the end. I would like to explain this problem first. The final collapse of Nutshell's little white flower mecha was due to the long period of external attacks. On this point, we have to admit that the pilot controlling the Purple Sea had great combat power. On the other hand, the collapse of the Purple Sea was due to an internal engine error. In future battles with the Empire, which one is more fatal is a very simple logical question. At this point, Shang Qiu paused for a moment. She habitually used the tips of her slender fingers to push up the frame of her glasses on her nose. Her nails were not painted with anything, looking very fresh and beautiful. She knew very well that Manager Jose's strict orders from below the stage were not false. This Federation actually did not welcome the things she had wanted to do at the beginning. When Su Lu had first released the news online, the President's office had already been enraged. They had wanted to beat the leader of the Federation's academic community down to the ground. Moreover, they had wanted to ruthlessly step on his old face. This had indeed touched the sensitive nerves of many important people and hurt many people's interests, even if these important people had initially stood on the opposite side of the Federal Academy of Science. However, this actually had nothing to do with the trust of the citizens towards the government that Jose had just mentioned. This was purely a matter of face for the Federation. The class that controlled this Federation did not want to show their ugly side in front of the ordinary citizens of the Federation. Even the citizens of the Federation probably did not want to know about Director Lin Yuanhu's moral problems. Once the beautiful image of a master idol was shattered, it would bring about mental pain. Thus, most people would rather not know the truth, only living in the lofty facade created by the newspapers and periodicals. Shang Qiu thought to himself in a self-deprecating manner. Wasn't he the same? Before Su Lu used data, calculations, and today's facts to convince her, how could she believe that Dean Lin Yuanhu would do those things? She was not going to say anything else, so she closed the calculations she had been preparing for a long time. Slowly raising her head, she said, "The Purple Sea Mecha's performance is indeed excellent, but since it is a new military standard mecha, its stability is of course." Suddenly, she saw familiar faces on her right. They were her partners who had worked day and night with her for several years. Her partners all had puzzled expressions on their faces. They were probably wondering why Shang Qiu was so calm today. The other people in the command hall were not surprised. A young and beautiful female engineer was able to become a first-class technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department. There must be a lot of different things about her. The people of the federal military felt that this level of calmness was the quality of the engineer who designed the MX mecha. "I can't go on," Shang Qiu suddenly said with a frown. Shang Qiu suddenly frowned and said. Then she took off her glasses and threw them on the table. Looking at the people on the stage, she took a few deep breaths and said, "Because this is not what I wanted to say." Below the stage, Mr. Jose's expression darkened slightly. He had received a call earlier and found out about the final decision of the board of directors, and Mr. President. That was why he had spoken to Shang Qiu earlier. However, at this moment, it seemed that Shang Qiu on the stage had lost control of her emotions. He was about to send someone else up when a voice rang out from the stands. "What did you originally want to say? Then say it." The people in the command hall turned to look and found that the speaker was President Sieg. Shang Qiu glanced at the president with some surprise, and then glanced at Dean Lin not far from the president's side. She found that in these few hours, Dean Lin Yuanhu looked quite a few years older. She was silent for a long time. Her fingertips on the table suddenly brushed against the frame of her glasses. She paused slightly, as if waking up. Taking a deep breath, she flipped open the data book on the table and said in a clear voice, "Regarding today's MX Mecha combat test, I only want to say a few points. 1. The Nutshell Engineering Department won. 2. Since 14 years ago, when the seniors of the Nutshell Engineering Department started the project, the design goal of the MX Mecha was close combat at high speed. The MX Mecha will definitely, and is currently, changing the way land combat is conducted in the future. Only new mecha can deal with new mecha, and overclocking combat will be very common. An MX that cannot support overclocking combat is not an MX at all. 3. The Purple Sea's final engine failure was not a problem of overheating, but a fatal flaw in the design. This design error cannot be fixed at all unless the assembly system is modified. At this time, a professor from the Academy of Science in the audience suddenly protested softly, "Since it can be modified, why say that it cannot be fixed?" Shang Qiu glanced at him and said word by word, "Because the Academy of Science's design started from a wrong parameter in the momentum measurable function model. In reality, after correcting this parameter, the assembly design that can be made will definitely lose a portion of its mobility. There is only one way to solve this problem. The Nutshell Engineering Department discovered this wrong parameter and corrected it, resulting in the current little white flower. If the Academy of Science can fix this error, the final mecha engine system they design will definitely be identical to the little white flower we designed. And now, we already have the little white flower. Is there a need to modify the Purple Sea into a little white flower?" These words echoed in the command hall. The professors and experts in the Academy of Science area all revealed angry expressions. Although the design philosophy of the two MXs was the same, the basic core data and function model had been researched separately. What right did the Nutshell Engineering Department have to be so sure that if the Academy of Science's MX was to be modified, they could only go down the Nutshell Engineering Department's old path. Shang Qiu lowered his head slightly and said softly, "The reason why I am so sure of this is because I know, and some people know as well. The theory, core data, and function model used by the Federal Academy of Sciences (MX-MECA) to solve the problem of the electron jet are exactly the same as the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. This is the fourth point I want to make today, and also the last point." The meaning of this sentence was a bit of a mouthful, but how could the many experts immersed in the field of science not understand? Shang Qiu was officially accusing the Federal Academy of Science of plagiarizing or stealing the results of the Nutshell Engineering Department's research on the electron jet. For a moment, the entire command hall was in an uproar. The staff of the Nutshell Engineering Department had already heard of this rumor through the internet. Although they did not understand why engineer Shang Qiu was so sure, they were not too surprised. However, the experts of the General Assembly Base and the Federal Academy of Science were also a bit angry. Plagiarism was without a doubt the most serious accusation in the academic world. The research and development of the MX-MECA at the Federal Academy of Science had always been personally led by Dean Lin Yuanhu. How could these members of the Federation's academic community believe that the respected leader would do such a shameless thing? Shang Qiu raised his head and put on his glasses again. He did not look at the increasingly hunched body of the old man in the stands. Instead, he looked at the still angry experts of the Academy of Science and said calmly, "I know this is a very serious accusation, but it is also the truth. Because long before this battle, I and another technical supervisor of the engineering department had already calculated from the original data that the Purple Sea mecha, after entering the overclocked state, would not last more than 3 minutes." After saying this, Shang Qiu connected the data storage box in his hand to the instrument on the table. On the holographic screen in the command hall, a few complex structural design diagrams appeared, as well as a few important parameter deviations that did not involve confidentiality. Looking at the rolling diagrams and parameter analysis on the holographic screen, the experts and professors gradually quieted down. They felt that the whole thing was beginning to develop in a strange direction. Shang Qiu's indifferent voice continued to sound in the command hall following the results of these calculations. The failure of the experiment last autumn was precisely due to a problem with the Z4 electron jet. The MX must complete the capture of the electron jet traces. The core data we used to solve this problem was the result of the research of Professor Xin Yulin of the Husk Institute. Let us begin our calculations from this original function model with the wrong parameters. The orientation of the particle entering the pipe interface is as shown on the diagram. The structural changes of the mecha's engine containment chamber are as shown on the diagram. The problem is that after the MX enters the overclocked state, the dual-engine particle containment chamber will be in a quantum full state for a long time. The originally captured electron jet traces will change slightly again. The modified Z4 electron jet requires a second adjustment, but with the current level of technology of the Federation, this is something that cannot be done. After a long period of hard work, the Nutshell Engineering Department found and corrected the wrong parameter, changing the design of the Z4 electron jet once again. In order to do so, they sacrificed a portion of the power output. However, they successfully avoided the fatal problem that would occur in the engine under quantum saturation. Let us continue to follow the Academy of Sciences design and calculate downward. Because of the existence of the wrong parameter, the Purple Sea Z4 electron jet design still followed the first path. The result of this was that the engine of machine number 1 suddenly stopped working. In the quiet command hall, Shang Qiu used simple words and the clear calculation process on the holographic screen to clearly and directly calculate why the Purple Sea's mecha had stopped working. She pushed up her glasses and looked down at the experts of the Academy of Science. Calmly, she said, "We only need to calculate, and we will know the final result." The last blueprint appeared under the holographic screen in the command hall. It was a drawing of the cracks on the inner wall of the engine made under laboratory conditions. Those cracks spread out in a radial pattern, leaving traces that could be seen. It was a shocking sight. The Purple Sea mecha on Mount Kaki in the Old Month has already entered the recovery program. Later, we can compare the remaining traces of the Purple Sea Mecha's engine with this blueprint that I calculated beforehand. It will be very clear that the core data and functional model used by the Purple Sea Mecha were all data that the Nutshell Engineering Department had long grasped. Below the stage, a professor from the Federal Academy of Science suddenly shouted, "What does this mean? This can't prove anything." Shang Qiu knew that this professor was the person in charge of the high-amplitude particle physics laboratory in the Federal Academy of Science and Technology. She frowned and replied, "If it wasn't for the Purple Sea explosion today, I indeed wouldn't have been able to prove anything. However, these radial patterns on the inner wall of the engine are enough to prove that your Academy of Science has done something. You have no evidence." The person in charge retorted angrily, "It must be that the Nutshell Engineering Department stole the data of the Academy of Science beforehand and found this hidden danger, but he didn't say anything. Now, he is using it to shamelessly slander us." Shang Qiu guessed that the professor below the stage must have been involved in the theft of the data. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so angry. Even now, he still insisted on quibbling. She could no longer control her emotions and said angrily to the people below the stage, "Don't forget that Professor Shen Yulin's core data was electronically protected. There is a backup in the Federal Central Computer. If you were just using it as a reference, no one would have found anything, but you actually copied it completely. With the backup of the central computer and the traces on the inner wall of the engine, this is irrefutable evidence." The female engineer looked at the silent Academy of Science professors with disappointment. After a moment, she said softly and indifferently, "You people are like clumsy thieves. You copied the test papers of your deskmate, but in the end, you even copied the answers that we wrote wrong at the beginning. The Federation's academic community is controlled by a group of shameless and stupid people like you. What future can there be?" This analogy was very good and powerful. The Academy of Science was directly hit speechless and did not have the courage to make any more excuses. On the stage, Shang Qiu's face was full of disappointment. She took a few deep breaths before she suppressed the complicated emotions in her heart and prepared to leave the stage. However, at this moment, Dean Lin Yuanhu slowly stood up and asked, "Do you have anything else to ask?" Shang Qiu was silent for a long time. She then said, "The time of the Purple Sea engine failure that we calculated should be 3 minutes later, but in reality, it happened 37 seconds earlier." Lin Yuanhu's body looked particularly bleak in the stands. He nodded and replied, "I don't have much research on quantum dynamics. After getting Yulin's data, based on my years of knowledge and intuition, I always felt that there was a parameter in the function model. It always seemed a bit out of place and a bit unsightly when placed in the queue. The older a person is, the more timid they become. Not to mention, this is the microscopic domain that I am not good at. Therefore, I did not make any changes to this parameter. I only reminded my colleagues in the institute to add a high-sensitivity device to the Z4 electron jet. Once there was an abnormal situation in the engine reactor, it would react. The Purple Sea engine did fail, but it did not spread to the fuselage and cause a full-scale explosion. I am very comforted by this." Shang Qiu suddenly asked, "Is it an irreversible cooling reaction?" "Yes." Chapter 259. With the data backup from the Federal Central Computer in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, as well as the radial crack distribution on the inner wall of the engine calculated by the Nutshell Engineering Department beforehand, unless the Nutshell Engineering Department could predict the future, there was no other explanation other than the Academy of Science plagiarizing the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. The broken engine of the Purple Sea Mecha far away in the old moon was no longer important, at least to the Academy of Science. If the burn flow traces on the engine were really the same as the image Shang Qiu had shown them, this kind of post-mortem investigation would be a humiliation they could not bear. When the young female engineer from the Nutshell Engineering Department mentioned this point, Dean Lin Yuanhu knew that there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. So he stood up somewhat tiredly and said a few words to the other party, indirectly admitting that the Academy of Science had plagiarized Professor Shen Yulin's core data. The old dean had already stood up at this time. He narrowed his somewhat cloudy eyes and looked at the female engineer on the stage. The age spots on his face were particularly clear. At this moment, he looked at the young woman and thought of Shen Yulin in the cemetery. He thought of Shen Yulin's last disciple in the Old Moon, that guy called Su Lu. Some time ago, Dean Lin Yuanhu had gone to the Milky Way cemetery to see Professor Shen's grave. After all, the two of them were once close friends. Although in their long lives, because of a certain despicable person, they had parted ways, Dean Lin Yuanhu bowed slightly in all directions and did not say a word. Back then, he needed to perfect the design of the warship's multi-engine system. He needed the Academy of Sciences resources and a step forward, so he secretly copied and extended Professor Shen Yulin's M-series design. That was how he gained the glory and status of the past few decades. Decades had passed, and Shen Yulin was already dead. Under his suppression, no one dared to mention the academic storm from back then. He was still used to working and living that way, but in the end, he suffered the heaviest blow of his life in the development of the MX mecha. That guy who likes to smoke, could he be laughing at me in the cemetery right now? The old and weak Dean Lin thought to himself. The entire command hall was dead silent. At this time, no one dared to open their mouths because the truth that Shang Qiu had revealed was too shocking. The important figures of the Federation in the stands all looked towards the president, but all they saw was President Sieg's incomparably gloomy face. Shang Qiu looked at the thin figure of Dean Lin in the stands, and countless complex emotions welled up in her heart. She actually couldn't bear to look at this hunched old man. Although she knew very well that Su's mission was to seek justice, the Academy of Science and Dean Lin Shit's reputation, she still lowered her head silently and began sorting through the data evidence. Back then, Lin Yuanhu had led the Federation's scientific community to successfully develop the M52 mecha, and perfected the design of the warship's multi-engine system. Then, the Federation's mobile company produced the mecha, establishing an immortal contribution. With his position in the Federation these past few years and the substantial results he had achieved, if he just stepped down from the position of Dean of the Academy of Science, it would be enough to earn him a lifetime of respect. However, the human heart was never enough. Just as Li Xiuzhu had once lamented, the most difficult hurdle in Lin Yuanhu's life was the word name. Before this academic leader retired, he had still wanted to carve his name on the revolutionary new mecha, putting in another heavy chip to win the Nebula Lifetime Achievement Award, but in the end, he had failed because of this matter. Shang Qiu was a student of the Capital University, but she had once sat in on Dean Lin's lectures at the First Military Academy. Lin Yuanhu's perfect explanation of the warship's multi-engine system had a great impact on her. The reason she could finally complete the design of the dual-engine system based on the research of her predecessors in the Nutshell Engineering Department could be said to have a lot to do with Dean Lin's research results. Today, in front of everyone, she had accused Lin Yuanhu of plagiarism. The moment she lowered her head to tidy up, she couldn't help but think of a scene from 4 years ago. That year, the Dean of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, paid a rare visit to the Shell Motor Company's space headquarters. He gave a speech to the design staff and promised to answer questions after the speech. At the time, Shang Qiu had already entered the Nutshell Engineering Department. After hearing the news, she asked for leave at the last minute to attend this rare event. However, after the speech, the space headquarters venue was silent. Lin Yuanhu stood on the podium for a long time, but still, no one asked a question. When the respected dean left with a smile, the human resources manager of the Nutshell Space Headquarters asked the engineering staff in confusion, "This is such a rare opportunity. Why didn't you raise your hand to ask a question?" After a moment of silence, one of the engineers replied with a sigh, "If you asked the creator to ask a question, would you dare?" At the time, Shang Qiu also held the same view of this old man in the Federation's academic community. However, today, she had personally knocked him off his pedestal. She silently hugged the documents and walked down the podium. She didn't pay attention to Mr. Jose, who was frowning. She also didn't speak to her colleagues beside her. She directly sat down in her seat. The command hall was silent. However, this silence was completely different from the silence in the venue that year. President Sigurd stood up with a heavy expression. He didn't even look at Lin Yuanhu and left the command hall. Lin Yuanhu stood quietly in the center of the viewing platform. His body was slightly bent, and he looked unusually desolate. In the dead silent polar region of the moon, a formation of 4 spaceships flew to the platform at the top of Mount Kaki. The spaceships reluctantly landed. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship opened. The thick mechanical arm began to retrieve the mecha. The 3 major systems of the Purple Sea mecha were basically all scrapped. After the Purple Sea mecha fell, Little White Flower couldn't bear the strain of the mecha's body anymore. When the Federal military's battleship took off, the 2 mechas were like 2 piles of garbage. They couldn't make any angry objections to the rough movements of the thick mechanical arm. The mechanical arm retracted. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship closed. With a large jet of air, the spaceship broke free of the moon's gravity and flew towards the dark side of the moon. Inside the spacious spaceship, dozens of soldiers were busy inspecting the spaceships. Under the control of the computer, the ring-shaped metal mechanical arm was quickly dismantling the 2 scrapped mechas. Whether it was the descendant of the Lees of Philadelphia or the Nutshell Mecha Master who won the final victory, to the Federal military, they were all extremely valuable assets. The Federal military naturally didn't want their safety to be in any danger. In the cockpit, Su Li's lips were already curled up with dry flying skin. After Little White Flower stopped working, he took the initiative to remove the simulation system and put it back into the black box. He then changed into the backup operations suit. He knew that this black box wouldn't be able to hide it from the military researchers, but he didn't want to tell them anything. As one of the designers of the MX mecha and the pilot who won, Su Li had this confidence in his heart. The cabin door opened. The soft artificial light replaced the harsh light of the stars in the vacuum environment. Su Li squinted his eyes and immediately adapted to the environment inside the spaceship. With the help of a few medical personnel, he forced himself to suppress the soreness in his muscles and crawled out of the cockpit with difficulty. Looking back, he saw that the beautiful Little White Flower's mecha was no longer the same as before. It was like it had been kicked countless times. It was black and distorted. It was very ugly and miserable. What is this? 2 military mechanics in charge of collecting data lifted the black leather box and asked Su Li. Su Li blinked tiredly and said, "Personal item. You can check the catalog. Please don't touch it." On the other side of the spacious cabin, Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng in the Purple Sea mecha also walked out with the help of the soldiers. Purple Sea's damage was more serious than Little White Flower's. When the military spaceship dragged the mecha back, the researchers discovered with fear that Purple Sea's last layer of life support system was already on the verge of collapse. If they had been any slower, the pilot in Purple Sea might have directly come into contact with the vacuum of the moon's surface. However, Madman Li didn't need anyone to support him. This was because compared to Su Li, the impact on his body was smaller. From the moment Purple Sea collapsed, this 16-year-old genius pilot fell into silence. His face, which was already prone to violent expressions, was now so cold that it made people's hearts palpitate. The special operations suit from before was no longer tightly wrapped around his explosive body. He was wearing a lieutenant colonel's military uniform. Standing on the floor, he turned his head to look at the other side of the cabin.